Welcome to Relaxing Historian Journey channel. Tonight we wander through stone corridors that have seen centuries pass, yet their chill remains constant. Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to lie down on a bed of straw, in a space where the walls themselves seem to draw warmth from your very bones? Perhaps you think of dungeons as distant, almost fantastical places filled with chains and darkness. In reality, they were far colder, damper, and far less forgiving than you might imagine. Each stone seems to hum with the weight of forgotten footsteps, and the air carries a scent that is more than a mere absence of warmth. The cold penetrates slowly, creeping under your garments, curling around your fingers and toes, whispering that sleep will not come easily. You hear the faint echo of water dripping somewhere deep in the shadow, a rhythm as relentless as time itself, each drop landing with a soft but deliberate persistence that seems almost mocking. So, before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. Share with us in the comments your location and the local time as you drift along with this journey. Imagine yourself entering the stone chamber now, the light from the torch flickering weakly against the rough surfaces, casting shadows that stretch and twist across the walls. You can feel the unevenness of the floor beneath your bare feet, the cold stone biting softly at your soles. The air smells damp, metallic perhaps, with the faint hint of mould lingering in every corner. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the thin fabric offer little resistance to the chill, but it is comforting in some way to have any layer at all. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dim glow, revealing chains dangling from iron rings embedded in the walls. The smell of straw and old cloth mingles with something more elusive, a hint of sweat from long-forgotten prisoners who once occupied this space. The walls are thick, nearly 2 meters in some places, which keeps intruders out but also keeps the cold firmly trapped inside. You can almost feel the stones themselves absorbing every bit of heat, storing it like a memory, and sharing it reluctantly with anyone daring to rest here. Some historians still argue whether the prisoner's clothing or the dungeon itself caused the worst suffering, but either way, the experience of lying down here is an intimate acquaintance with discomfort. You imagine settling onto the rough bedding, a thin layer of straw perhaps softened slightly with rags or scraps of old clothing. Every movement sends tiny particles scattering into the air, tickling your nose and throat. You hear a rat scuttle across the far corner, claws slicking against the stone. It is not frightening, not yet, but it reminds you of how alive this environment is in its own peculiar way. Dampness seeps upward from the floor, chilling your skin through layers of cloth, making every moment awake feel like a test of endurance. You wonder how long it will take for sleep to come, and whether it will ever truly arrive without interruption. The torchlight casts a moving glow, flickering as if hesitant, revealing carved marks in the walls where previous prisoners might have etched names, dates, or cryptic symbols. You think about the stories those marks could tell, though time has left them faded and enigmatic. Perhaps someone scratched a farewell or a hope for mercy, perhaps a mundane record of days counted in silence. The uncertainty adds to the weight in the room, and yet there is something strangely comforting in knowing that you are not the first to endure this cold, to feel the stones pressing in from all sides. The soundscape is subtle but ceaseless. You listen to the occasional echo of distant footsteps along a hallway you cannot see, the muffled drip of water that falls into a shallow puddle somewhere near your feet, the soft scratching of rodents as they hunt for scraps. Each sound fills the silence and makes you aware of your own heartbeat, the gentle rhythm that insists on moving even when the world around you seems suspended. Sometimes the mind starts to fill in the gaps with imagined whispers or the faint hint of a voice, and you realize that isolation amplifies every sensation. The darkness, the cold, and the quiet together shape an environment where your senses are sharper, more attuned to every subtle shift in air or shadow. Your hands brush over the stone floor as you try to get comfortable. The texture is uneven, sometimes slick from moisture, sometimes rough and pitted with age. You can smell the mineral tang of the stone, mixed with the earthy scent of straw and the faint, sour remnants of previous meals. Some scholars debate whether the dungeons were deliberately designed to break the body and spirit, or simply a byproduct of architectural limitations and climate. Either way, the effect is clear. The cold is a constant companion, the walls unyielding, the nights impossibly long. You close your eyes briefly and imagine the cold climbing your spine, curling around your limbs, drawing tiny shivers from your body. In these conditions, warmth is fleeting and precious. Prisoners might have huddled together or pressed against the stones for minimal comfort. But even these attempts offered little relief. You can almost feel the sensation of frost creeping into fingers and toes, the subtle ache that comes from prolonged exposure to damp and cold reminding you with gentle insistence that comfort is scarce here. Perhaps you notice your breathing, the slight steam that rises in the torchlight from your own lungs, and the way the air feels denser with every inhale. Each breath carries not only the scent of stone and straw, but a whisper of history, a reminder that countless lives have intersected in this space, leaving traces that are invisible but undeniably present. You feel a quiet empathy for those who have lain here before, shivering in the dark, listening to the endless drip and skitter, counting days in a rhythm only the dungeon knows. Sleep may not arrive easily tonight, and that is part of the truth. The dungeon offers lessons in endurance, awareness, and presence. It is not a place of comfort, but it is a place where the senses come alive and where the mind cannot help but wander. Perhaps you imagine a faint memory of warmth, a hearth long ago, or a glimpse of sunlight on a distant morning, and for a moment, the cold feels less absolute. Yet the stone still presses against your skin, the shadows still move, and the dripping water continues its patient beat. You feel both small and deeply connected to a long thread of human experience, to those who endured the same chill, the same darkness, and the same uncertain night. And so, as your eyelids grow heavy, you let yourself drift into this reality, walking carefully between awareness and sleep. Imagine the cool air filling your lungs, the faint smell of history lingering around you, and the sensation of straw beneath your fingers. You are learning what it means to rest in a place that offers no comfort except the quiet presence of time itself. Each breath, each heartbeat, each whisper of shadow and stone carries you gently closer to sleep. Now, dim the lights, then flow directly into story. You step deeper into the dungeon and immediately notice how the architecture itself seems to conspire against comfort. Thick stone walls rise around you, their surfaces cold and damp to the touch, absorbing what little warmth the torchlight offers. Narrow, slit-like windows barely let any light through, often placed high above so that the outside world feels distant and unreachable. The ceilings are low in some sections, forcing you to stoop, yet vast in others, creating echoes that make every movement seem amplified. You feel the walls press inward, not physically, but in a way that makes your senses hyper-aware of every uneven surface, every crack, every moisture-stained block. It is a space that was designed, perhaps unintentionally, to maintain control and inflict a persistent, almost invisible discomfort. You imagine running your fingers along the iron rings embedded in the walls. These were not merely decorative, they were functional restraints, reminders of confinement and submission. The stone around them is polished smooth from centuries of use, yet coldness has seeped in, chilling your touch. Some historians debate whether these rings were primarily punitive or practical, used to anchor prisoners while they slept or while performing labour. Perhaps both. The ambiguity makes the dungeon feel like a puzzle a mixture of intentions that you are only beginning to understand. The layout itself contributes to the misery. Corridors twist unpredictably, and dead ends seem designed to amplify the sense of being lost. Your footsteps echo softly, bouncing from wall to wall, creating a faint rhythm that can either soothe or unsettle, depending on how attentive your mind becomes. The stone floors are uneven, slick in places with moisture, rough in others with jagged protrusions. Even walking carefully, you feel the chill creeping upward from the floor, reaching your ankles and climbing relentlessly. The architecture not only shapes the physical space but also manipulates sensation, creating a persistent awareness of discomfort. As you move, you notice alcoves that might once have held torches or small furnishings, but most are empty now, leaving you to imagine how prisoners lived with minimal light. The few surviving torches or remnants of sconces are skeletal, casting flickering shadows that exaggerate the contours of the walls. Shadows stretch and bend, transforming the dungeon into a space that feels alive and aware of your presence. Your ears pick up subtle creaks from timbers above, distant water drips, and the occasional shuffle of unseen rodents. The design amplifies sound in unexpected ways, turning minor disturbances into prominent, almost intimate signals. You pause near a corner and feel the temperature drop. Stone walls retain cold far longer than you anticipate, creating pockets of frostiness that seep through clothing, dampness from centuries of exposure to rain, seepage, and underground humidity has left the stones slick, their surfaces radiating a persistent chill. Even the thickest garments offer limited defense. You notice how prisoners might have huddled together or against walls, seeking minimal warmth, though the architecture works against even that effort. Some scholars suggest that the very design of these spaces functioned as a subtle form of psychological control, teaching endurance through constant, low-level suffering rather than dramatic punishment. You begin to trace the layout with your eyes, noticing how corridors often lead to small chambers, each designed for containment and observation. Many of these rooms have niches, low ceilings, and recessed areas, possibly used to separate prisoners from each other or to confine them in isolation. The architectural choices are practical yet inherently uncomfortable. Narrow staircases twist sharply, leaving no room for movement without careful attention. Every step you take reminds you that space was carefully constructed to balance confinement with oversight. The placement of windows, or rather their near absence, contributes to the psychological weight. Tiny slits high above provide minimal light and no warmth, leaving prisoners to rely almost entirely on torches or candles. The outside world is largely inaccessible, its presence hinted at only by faint streaks of light or the distant sound of wind and rain. This separation from the sun and open air reinforces isolation, emphasizing the cold and darkness that dominate the dungeon environment. You begin to notice how your perception of time might be altered, with days and nights blurring into a continuous stretch of shadow and chill. Your hands brush along the stone walls as you move, discovering areas smoothed by repeated touch and other areas roughened by years of neglect. Every block seems to have its own texture, its own subtle story. You imagine the hands that carved them, placed them, and eventually touched them in moments of despair. Perhaps some carried messages scratched into the stone, while others were used to tether chains or secure doors. The tactile variety creates a subtle awareness that your body cannot escape, a constant dialogue between stone and skin. The corridors also shape airflow, creating drafts that intensify the cold. Even in the absence of open windows, the stones allow air to seep in, and movement within the space amplifies its effect. You feel currents of icy air brushing against your face, carrying the faint scent of mold, wet stone, and something you cannot quite identify. Perhaps it is the lingering essence of past inhabitants, The movement of air is gentle, almost unnoticed at first, yet persistent enough to keep the cold in constant dialogue with your body. Some areas of the dungeon were likely more punitive than others. You notice spaces where the ceilings are particularly low, where doors were reinforced with thick iron, and where chains suggest long-term confinement. The architecture itself communicates a hierarchy of discomfort, guiding prisoners from minor unease to severe hardship. Historians still argue whether these choices were primarily intentional punishments or merely the result of practical limitations in medieval construction techniques. The uncertainty gives the space a layered complexity, one that continues to influence the sensory experience. You imagine the nights in these corridors, when torches guttered and shadows merged, leaving prisoners in near total darkness. Every stone surface at every angle of the ceiling seems to amplify sound and chill, turning the space into an almost living entity. Footsteps, drips, and scurrying creatures became the companions of sleepless nights. The architecture, with its twists, turns, and chambers, ensured that no place offered true respite, reinforcing the persistent discomfort and emphasizing isolation. In quieter areas, you notice remnants of small doors or barred gates, designed to separate prisoners or restrict movement. These structures create micro-environments within the dungeon, pockets of relative stillness or heightened exposure to cold drafts. The intentional segmentation allows minimal control over conditions, yet the overall effect is one of pervasive, unrelenting discomfort. You feel the contrast between spaces immediately, sensing how even subtle changes in design could influence how cold or dark a prisoner's night would feel. Your imagination begins to fill in the lives of those who move through these spaces, perhaps a prisoner pressed against a stone wall for warmth, listening to the echoes of distant footsteps and wondering if someone would arrive with food or water. Another might have traced the edges of the walls with their fingers, measuring time through tactile engagement. The architecture demanded attention to every detail, every crack and crevice, and shaped an environment where comfort was fleeting and alertness constant. You pause to consider the psychological impact of such design. Long corridors and low ceilings create a sense of compression and isolation, while higher chambers and twists in the layout amplify uncertainty. The dungeon's construction subtly instills a constant awareness of presence and absence, of comfort denied and exposure enforced. The very walls teach endurance, and your mind begins to feel how difficult it must have been to find rest amidst this calculated discomfort. The walls themselves tell stories of centuries, etched with marks that have survived the passage of time. Faded inscriptions, scratches, and worn edges suggest attempts to leave a personal imprint on an otherwise impersonal space. You imagine the contrast between these human touches and the unyielding nature of the stone, and how prisoners might have clung to small acts of expression in an environment designed to suppress them. As you walk further, you notice how narrow passageways occasionally open into slightly larger chambers. These rooms might have offered slightly more space, yet they are no less cold. Iron-dowel bars, chains, and sparse remnants of bedding maintain the oppressive atmosphere. Every architectural choice reinforces the message that the dungeon is not a place for comfort, reflection, or ease. You feel how the design itself manipulates the senses, intensifying awareness of cold, darkness, and isolation. Even the staircases, often steep and twisted, play a role in discomfort. Moving between levels creates drafts and echoes, altering the perception of space and time. The architecture ensures that no movement offers total reprieve. The stone seems to absorb warmth and reflect cold, creating a sensory experience that prisoners could not escape, no matter how carefully they positioned themselves or moved through the space. Finally, you pause to imagine the stillness of night, when no torch flickers and footsteps are absent. The corridors become a silent, cold expanse. Yet the design ensures that no place is truly quiet or still. Every surface interacts with the body, every passage shapes the air, and every shadow heightens the senses. In this way, the dungeon itself becomes a character, an unyielding companion in a long night that stretches endlessly. The architecture does more than confine bodies, it shapes perception, molds experience, and subtly enforces endurance. You sense how each choice, from narrow windows to thick walls, influenced both the physical and psychological conditions of those who slept here. This is a space designed not for comfort, but for persistence, where every detail amplifies the chill, darkness, and awareness of the stone surrounding you. The warmth you might expect from a flickering torch or a small fire is surprisingly limited in a medieval dungeon. You step into a chamber and notice the faint remnants of soot on the walls, evidence of attempts to create comfort. Yet even these efforts were fleeting. A single torch can illuminate only so much, and the light it casts does little to penetrate the persistent cold that the stone stores. You imagine how prisoners might have huddled near the fire, only to feel the chill return almost immediately after it died down. The room retains the memory of heat briefly, but it is as if the stone itself resists human comfort, absorbing warmth and giving it back only reluctantly. You hear the soft crackle of embers and imagine the effort required to maintain a fire in such damp conditions. The wood must have been scarce and precious, and smoke often hung heavily in the room, stinging the eyes and filling the nose with an acrid tang. Some historians suggest that prisoners were allowed only intermittent fires, while others argue that heat was a privilege rarely extended beyond those who could bribe guards. The uncertainty adds a layer of tension to every night, a quiet anxiety about whether warmth will last long enough to offer even temporary relief. The floor beneath your feet is uneven, with puddles forming in depressions that have collected water from leaking ceilings. You notice the faint scent of wet stone rising with the heat of the fire, mixing with the musty odour of straw and old fabrics used as bedding. Dampness penetrates clothing quickly, leaving skin cold and clammy even in proximity to flames. Some of the rooms may have had rudimentary fireplaces or braziers, but many were simply too small or poorly ventilated to allow sustained warmth. You feel the subtle ache that comes from prolonged exposure, a reminder that fire alone could never fully compensate for the dungeon's persistent chill. You imagine a prisoner rolling a threadbare cloak into a makeshift pillow, attempting to create a barrier between body and stone. The fire offers fleeting comfort, and then the chill returns, creeping into the gaps between thin layers of cloth. Even if guards provided torches or small stoves, smoke and drafts made the air difficult to breathe. Some scholars debate whether intermittent heating was intended primarily for survival or as a method of controlling rest and sleep cycles. The ambiguity makes the experience both physically and mentally exhausting, reinforcing the dungeon's subtle domination over those who dwelled within. The soundscape of the room amplifies discomfort. Water drips from unseen cracks, creating a gentle but persistent rhythm that underscores the sensation of exposure. You hear the faint scurrying of rats seeking warmth near the walls, their claws scratching against stone, and occasionally the distant groan of timber under the weight of the structure. The fire does little to mask these sounds, and in some ways, the crackle of embers becomes another layer of sensory stimulation that the mind cannot easily ignore. Isolation and attentiveness combine to make the dungeon feel alive, as if the space itself is monitoring the prisoner's endurance. The dampness in the air encourages a host of minor ailments. Skin chafes from wet fabric, noses run, and joints ache from prolonged exposure. A single ember may offer temporary comfort, but the persistent moisture ensures that cold is never truly absent. Historians still argue whether diseases were more often caused by the cold or by poor hygiene, and the debate highlights how these conditions compounded the misery of nightly life. Even a healthy body would struggle to find equilibrium in a space designed to retain cold and resist warmth, making every night a delicate negotiation with the environment. You notice how prisoners may have used their own ingenuity to cope. Perhaps a small pile of straw was placed strategically near the fire to catch heat, or pieces of clothing were layered to insulate against drafts. These small acts of adaptation hint at resilience, a quiet determination to endure despite the dungeon's indifference. Yet every solution was limited, every comfort fleeting. The fire could not reach every corner, and cold always returned, claiming spaces that warmth briefly touched. You sense the psychological tension between effort and futility, a subtle, ongoing trial that the architecture and dampness together enforce. In imagining the experience further, you think about nights when the fire finally dies, darkness returns almost immediately, and with it comes a profound awareness of exposure. Your body retains only the memory of warmth, a fragile sensation that fades as the stone reclaims its cold dominion. The chill is not sudden but insistent, creeping up the spine, settling into joints, and embedding itself in the skin. Every muscle tenses in response, creating a physical stress that intertwines with the mental challenge of enduring both cold and isolation. The air itself seems alive with moisture. Breaths condense in the dim glow, forming tiny clouds that drift upward and mingle with lingering smoke. Even when sitting close to a fire, the sensation of cold persists, carried in drafts and absorbed by every surface. Some scholars debate whether the intermittent warmth was meant to encourage brief periods of comfort or simply to prevent frostbite. Either way, the design ensures that relief is temporary and often illusory. You imagine adjusting a cloak, leaning against the wall, feeling the cold seep back, and counting the moments until fire can return or until dawn offers even minimal change. The sensory contrast between fire and stone is stark. Flickering warmth illuminates the room and softens its harsh lines, yet stone absorbs heat rapidly, ensuring that any sensation of comfort is brief. The interplay between light, heat, and cold creates an almost theatrical experience, one that highlights endurance and adaptation. You might imagine a prisoner tracing the edges of the walls, seeking pockets of warmth or dry floor, attempting small adjustments in a room that resists comfort at every turn. Each movement is subtle but critical, and awareness of the environment becomes a constant companion, guiding posture, gestures, and focus. Even the smoke from the fire adds complexity. Inhaling it can sting the eyes and irritate the throat, a small but persistent challenge that diminishes the simple pleasure of warmth. Yet it also brings a faint olfactory distraction from the pervasive dampness, offering a fleeting sensory complexity that might be soothing in its irregularity. You notice how every element, fire, stone, air, and draft, interacts with the others, creating an environment that is almost consciously designed to test endurance and attention. As your attention moves from the fire to the walls and floor, you notice subtle features intended to increase discomfort or limit comfort. Low ceilings prevent upright movement, narrow passages restrict activity, and uneven floors make positioning for sleep difficult. The fire offers only localized warmth, leaving extremities chilled. Some historians debate whether this was intentional or simply a byproduct of medieval construction, yet the effect is undeniable. The architecture ensures that warmth is partial, temporary, and fragile, emphasizing endurance rather than relaxation. You imagine huddling near the fire, feeling the contrast between its fleeting heat and the omnipresent cold of stone. Every breath you take mixes warmth and chill, smoke and damp, creating a tactile and olfactory layering that occupies your full attention. Even the sounds of the fire, soft crackling and occasional popping, underscore the impermanence of relief. Your body reacts instinctively to seek warmth, yet every effort is met with the persistent resistance of architecture and environment. The firelight reveals textures in the walls you had not noticed before. Patches of moss cling stubbornly to damp surfaces, and faint scratches hint at previous occupants. The warmth briefly illuminates these details, but cold quickly reasserts itself. You feel how fragile comfort can be, how fleeting moments of heat contrast sharply with persistent chill. It is an experience that requires awareness, patience, and adaptation, teaching lessons about the limits of human resilience against the environment. Finally, you imagine the night stretching ahead, torches gutter, embers fade, and darkness reclaims the space. Yet your senses remain active. Cold, damp, and sound interact to create a vivid, persistent awareness that sleep will be difficult to achieve. Even when the fire returns or a torch is relit, relief is fleeting, a temporary reprieve from the inescapable presence of stone, air, and dampness. The dungeon offers no true comfort, only moments of adaptation, endurance, and reflection on the persistence of the human body and mind in an environment that resists ease. You find yourself approaching the modest bedding provided in the dungeon, a small patch of straw pressed into the stone floor. It is rough and uneven, barely offering a cushion between body and stone, and the scent of straw mingles with the damp, mineral-rich air. You notice tiny fragments of cloth scattered within, perhaps remnants of garments that previous occupants used to add a thin layer of comfort. Medieval records suggest that most prisoners were expected to sleep on this simple bedding without additional warmth or padding, making each night an exercise in endurance. Even the softest straw feels abrasive against skin already chilled by stone and draught. The arrangement of the sleeping area varies from chamber to chamber. In some dungeons, prisoners were allowed to create small mounds of straw to insulate themselves from the cold floor. In others, iron chains were positioned so closely that lying down meant contorting the body around them. There is evidence from certain accounts that some prisoners would carefully position themselves in relation to walls or corners, seeking tiny pockets of warmth where the stone absorbed sunlight during the day, or where a torch's flicker lingered. The ingenuity required for such small adjustments reveals an intimate negotiation with discomfort. You reach out to touch the bedding and notice how dampness has settled into every fibre. Wet straw clings stubbornly to clothing, and even a thin cloak offers only marginal protection against the chill. You imagine how the dampness would exacerbate fatigue, making muscles stiff and joints sore by morning. The sensory experience is unrelenting rough textures beneath your body, the faint clink of chains when you shift, and the ever-present moisture curling along the edges of stone walls. This tactile reminder ensures that rest is never fully attainable. An unusual detail emerges as you examine the bedding more closely. Some historical accounts describe prisoners carefully layering straw in neat rows, almost ritualistically, sometimes incorporating bits of moss or scraps of fabric. These small methodical actions suggest that prisoners sought to maintain some sense of control over their immediate environment, even in conditions that were deliberately harsh. You can almost picture someone arranging these layers by candlelight, counting each row as if it could stave off the relentless cold. The air carries more than dampness. It carries faint odours of previous occupants. The mingling of sweat, unwashed clothing, and long-settled human presence creates an unmistakable scent that clings to every surface. Some texts from the period note that this scent could be so pervasive that new prisoners quickly learn to adapt, blending their own smell with the environment to avoid attracting the attention of rats or insects. The olfactory aspect of the dungeon adds a subtle psychological weight. As the body becomes constantly aware of an environment that is neither clean nor neutral, you notice how minor adjustments in posture are critical. Lying flat may maximize contact with warmth if a stray ember's heat reaches the floor, but it also exposes more of the body to the chill. Curled positions conserve heat but strain muscles over long periods. Some accounts describe prisoners moving carefully through the night, testing the temperature of the floor and walls, attempting to find a compromise between comfort and survival, the choices are small yet consequential, and each adjustment requires a delicate balance between physical sensation and mental endurance. There are also reports of prisoners using objects creatively. Pieces of wood, broken tools, or even stones might be placed under straw to create a firmer, warmer surface. Such improvisations were often minor, yet they could make the difference between a night of constant shivering and a slightly less punishing one. The adaptability of the human mind in these circumstances is striking, revealing a capacity to manipulate even the smallest environmental factors to gain fleeting comfort. Even sounds contribute to the sense of discomfort. Shifting straw makes soft scraping noises that echo against stone walls, chains jingle faintly when a prisoner moves, and the occasional scurry of a rat reminds you that you are not alone. In some dungeons, prisoners reported that distant sounds of other cells created both reassurance and anxiety, a reminder that life exists beyond their immediate suffering, but also a prompt to compare their conditions with those of others. The auditory landscape becomes part of the challenge, shaping awareness and influencing how easily sleep may come. Historians note that bedding arrangements often reflected status or the nature of confinement. Those held for longer periods or deemed more troublesome sometimes received thinner straw or none at all, while others in less harsh conditions could layer straw and clothing more freely. The variability underscores that even within the same dungeon, comfort was inconsistent, and survival often depended on small adaptive behaviours rather than material provisions. The challenge was as much about improvisation as it was about enduring cold or damp. An interesting anecdote from the period describes a prisoner who collected feathers from birds smuggled in through small openings, using them to enhance a thin layer of straw. The act was small, almost secretive, yet it demonstrates how people sought tactile comfort even when resources were nearly non-existent. This quiet resourcefulness reveals a subtle resilience, a human instinct to claim a small victory over an environment that offers very few. You feel the stone beneath the bedding, unyielding and indifferent. Even the thickest layer of straw offers minimal insulation, and the dampness that permeates the floor ensures that cold steadily returns to any exposed surface. You imagine the body's subtle reaction, shivers, tensed muscles, and restless shifting, all in response to the persistent chill. The dungeon's physical environment dictates every adjustment, every movement, and every attempt at comfort. The tactile experience is inseparable from the psychological one. Feeling the rough straw beneath you, smelling the lingering human presence, hearing faint echoes of movement all reinforce the sense that you are inhabiting a space designed for endurance rather than ease. Prisoners learn to anticipate discomfort, adjusting not only physically but mentally to cope with nights that stretched endlessly. Each layer of straw, each tiny improvisation, became a symbol of resilience, a small attempt to assert control over a world that offered very little. Another subtle challenge comes from moisture collecting in the straw itself. Over time, bedding becomes damp, making warmth almost impossible to retain. Some records suggest that prisoners would replace or rearrange straw when possible. Though this depended on access and opportunity, the process is slow and meticulous, a careful negotiation with the environment that underscores how even minor elements could dominate experience. You can almost feel the patience required to manage such a small aspect of survival. The placement of the bedding relative to walls or corners is also critical. Certain positions might trap slightly warmer air or shield from drafts, yet the difference is minimal. These choices highlight how sensitivity to the environment becomes acute when comfort is scarce. The body reacts instinctively, guided by both past experience and immediate sensation, attempting to find equilibrium in a space that resists it. You notice how small rituals might accompany sleep. Perhaps a prisoner adjusted straw carefully, arranged scraps of cloth, or positioned their body in alignment with the faint heat of a dying torch. These acts may have offered a sense of agency, a fragile acknowledgement that even in harsh conditions, small personal decisions still mattered. It is easy to imagine the comfort, however fleeting, of such rituals, a soft echo of normalcy in a world otherwise defined by deprivation. Finally, you reflect on the interplay of the body, environment, and mind. Every sensation, from the roughness of straw to the dampness of stone, contributes to an acute awareness of presence. Sleep is possible, but only tenuously, constantly interrupted by the dungeon's insistence on discomfort. You sense how endurance, adaptation, and attention to detail become intertwined, shaping a night in a frozen medieval hull cell. The lesson is subtle, but profound in conditions designed to resist comfort. Small acts of improvisation and acute awareness become survival itself. You inhale deeply and notice the distinct aroma that defines this dungeon space. The scent is a layered mixture of wet stone, mould, and centuries of human presence, faintly sweet in some areas from decayed straw and faintly acrid in others from residual smoke. It clings to the air, wrapping itself around every movement you make, reminding you that the environment is never neutral. Even when you press close to the wall, hoping to find a microclimate of warmth, the smell infiltrates your senses, subtle yet persistent, an invisible companion to your exploration. Walking slowly, you notice the dampness settling on your skin. Your fingers feel slick against the stone, and tiny beads of condensation form on your cheeks. Medieval dungeons often had minimal drainage, so moisture collected in the low points of floors, corners, and cracks in the walls. The persistent humidity intensifies the sensation of cold, and you can almost feel it creeping into the threads of your clothing. A record from the period suggests that prisoners sometimes slept with their feet elevated on scraps of wood to minimize contact with the cold, wet floor. Even small adjustments offered limited relief, but they reveal human ingenuity in response to relentless environmental stress. An unexpected detail emerges as you listen closely to the dungeon soundscape. Water drips irregularly from a ceiling crack, forming puddles that produce soft, rhythmic plinks against stone. Occasionally, the echo of a rat scratching somewhere beyond the shadows blends into the rhythm, creating a subtle, haunting melody. Some chronicles describe prisoners using these sounds to mark the passage of hours, mentally counting the intervals between drips as a distorted clock. You notice how isolation amplifies auditory perception, making each subtle noise feel significant, almost alive. The walls themselves seem to exhale moisture. Stone absorbs water and slowly releases it back into the air, creating a steady background dampness that resists attempts at warming. Your fingers brush the surface and tracing small pockmarks and fissures. You imagine the hands that once left marks here, perhaps in boredom, frustration, or the desperate need to mark existence. These tactile reminders connect you with a past where every human presence interacted intimately with the environment, leaving traces that are still perceptible centuries later. Prisoners often had to contend with more than just physical discomfort. The combination of darkness, cold, and persistent odors contributed to mental strain. Long nights blurred into days, and the human mind, deprived of stimulation, sometimes created its own patterns and voices. Some texts recount prisoners imagining conversations, shadows taking on sinister forms, or whispers that did not exist. The environment itself nurtured a heightened awareness of sound and smell, encouraging both vigilance and superstition. You notice the minimal lighting in some chambers. A torch guttering weakly casts uneven shadows along rough surfaces. Even the simplest gestures, such as moving your hand or shifting your body, create long, trembling silhouettes. The dance of light and dark plays tricks on perception, exaggerating the contours of stone and making corners seem sadder or closer than they are. One unusual account describes a prisoner who learned to use these shifting shadows to signal messages to a companion in an adjacent cell. It was a small, secretive act of communication, an ingenious use of the environment's peculiar qualities. Moisture interacts with temperature in surprising ways. You feel cold air pulling in depressions on the floor, while the stones around you retain slight traces of heat from previous sun exposure or torches. This uneven distribution forces constant adjustments, encouraging the body to shift frequently to maintain comfort. Some contemporary observers describe prisoners curling their bodies in small spaces to trap even minimal warmth, pressing extremities together or against the walls. These adaptive strategies demonstrate an intimate awareness of spatial microclimates, an instinctive negotiation with the architecture. The walls themselves seem to breathe. Each stone block retains the memory of water, warmth, and cold, subtly influencing the surrounding air. Even when you move away from puddles, draughts of cooler or slightly warmer air reach your face. Medieval chroniclers often noted the difficulty of maintaining a fire that could counteract this persistent moisture. Without continuous attention, embers would die, and the room would once again revert to its default chill. The fleeting nature of warmth created both physical and psychological tension, a constant push and pull between relief and deprivation. Prisoners adapted in creative ways. Small personal belongings, if allowed, might serve as insulation. A thin piece of fabric could be placed under a sleeping mat or rolled to support the neck. Some even pressed moss into gaps in the stone floor, attempting to reduce direct contact with cold surfaces. You imagine the careful, deliberate attention required to make such adjustments in near darkness, balancing between physical relief and conserving scarce resources. Every minor act of improvisation became a small assertion of control in a space designed to limit it. There is a sense of rhythm within the dungeon, though it is subtle and unsettling. Water drips, rats scurry, chains occasionally rattle, and the occasional distant footstep echoes down a corridor. These noises mark the passage of time in a fragmented, disorienting way. Unlike modern clocks, the environment itself dictates awareness, and the mind becomes adept at measuring intervals, anticipating patterns, and adjusting expectations. You feel how even the smallest auditory cues might provide comfort, structure, or anxiety depending on perception. The interplay of smell and sound also influences sleep. The dense, moist air carries odours that linger on clothing and hair, while the persistent echoes fill the silent spaces with intermittent noise. Chroniclers noted that even the faintest scent of food, brought by guards or fellow prisoners, could evoke strong reactions, hunger, comfort, or longing, while also intensifying the awareness of deprivation. You notice how these sensory cues combine to create a complex, immersive environment where physical sensation and mental focus are inseparable. You press closer to a wall to shield yourself from a minor draft. The stone is cold, but the slight irregularity of the surface offers minimal insulation. Medieval manuals occasionally suggest curling into corners to reduce exposure, though evidence indicates such positions were rarely comfortable for long durations. The human body must constantly adjust to cope with the cold, dampness, and uneven surfaces. Even a seemingly insignificant shift in posture can produce noticeable changes in warmth, pressure, and alertness. An unexpected observation emerges when you notice how some areas of the floor are slightly higher or lower. This unevenness creates microclimates, where warmth from a dying ember may linger slightly longer or cold air collects in pockets. Prisoners often discovered these subtleties through trial and error, learning over nights of hardship where to lie, how to adjust, and when to move. This constant interaction with subtle environmental cues emphasizes the dungeon's quiet dominance over those who occupied it. You consider how isolation intensifies every sensation. The faint smell of straw, damp stone, or distant smoke becomes more pronounced when no other human presence is near. The mind interprets minor irregularities in sound and temperature as signals, amplifying them into larger patterns. Some chroniclers suggest that this heightened perception contributed to both mental strain and resourceful adaptation, as prisoners learned to read their environment more acutely than would normally be necessary. Curiously, the layering of odours changes over time. Wet straw absorbs scents of the body, smoke, and surrounding stone, creating a persistent, evolving atmosphere. A prisoner lying down experiences these changes subtly, noticing how areas of the bedding feel different on contact and how air quality shifts slightly with movement. Such details, while minor, profoundly shape the perception of comfort and endurance. The combination of moisture, temperature, and sound influences even the simplest bodily functions. A chill pressing into the lower back, damp straw clinging to skin, and echoes in the chamber affect circulation, posture, and restfulness. You feel how tightly intertwined these factors are, reinforcing the notion that surviving a night in a dungeon required constant attention and adjustment, both mental and physical. You imagine someone adjusting their position repeatedly, seeking relief, curling arms and legs to retain heat, then shifting to avoid pressure points. Every movement is guided by the intuition honed over countless nights of observation and experience. There is a quiet, almost meditative quality to this constant negotiation, though it is born of necessity rather than choice. Finally, as your eyes trace the shadows of the chamber, you notice how the dungeon seems to extend endlessly. Walls, floors, and ceilings maintain their oppressive consistency, and every sound or scent carries with it a sense of continuity. Even as you settle near the bedding, the persistent cold, moisture, and echoes serve as reminders that the environment is in control. The room teaches patience, observation, and adaptation, slowly imparting lessons about endurance and the delicate balance between physical survival and psychological resilience. The dungeon's soundscape is unlike any other place you have known. Water drips consistently from cracks in the ceiling, forming shallow puddles that echo softly against stone. The rhythm is irregular, yet somehow hypnotic, blending with the occasional scratching of rats scuttling across the floor. Some accounts suggest that prisoners came to measure time by these drips, marking hours in a distorted liquid clock that left the mind both restless and attuned to subtle patterns. You feel how such a persistent soundtrack infiltrates awareness, shaping perception even when your attention drifts elsewhere. The small noises are never isolated. A distant creak from wooden beams above hints at settling, or perhaps the passage of a guard along an unseen corridor. Footsteps echo intermittently, sometimes muted, sometimes startlingly close. You notice that in the near darkness, every sound seems amplified, and your mind instinctively interprets it as movement, life, or threat. There is no need for threat to be present. The dungeon's architecture, with low ceilings, narrow passages, and angled walls, naturally exaggerates sound. You imagine a prisoner lying on a patch of damp straw, listening to this constant auditory pattern. The sounds, while mundane, could trigger vigilance or unease, forcing the mind to remain semi-alert even when the body craves rest. Chroniclers of the period describe moments when the combination of dripping water and skittering rats seemed almost musical, a perverse lullaby for those who could not sleep. Curiously, some prisoners reportedly memorized these patterns, finding in repetition a strange comfort or distraction from the cold and isolation. The dungeon's damp air affects sound in subtle ways. Moisture thickens the atmosphere, softening some echoes while sharpening others. Every footstep or movement produces a nuanced variation in resonance, creating an environment that constantly communicates. You notice how close you feel to the space itself, as if it were sentient, subtly guiding your awareness with auditory cues. This interaction of architecture, moisture, and sound forms an intricate backdrop that prisoners had to navigate nightly. The presence of rats adds another layer of complexity. You hear tiny claws tapping against stone, soft squeaks, and occasional rustles as they seek warmth and food. Historical records indicate that prisoners often shared their limited spaces with these creatures, adjusting their bedding and movements to avoid them or protect scraps of food. Some sources note that certain prisoners even befriended these animals in small ways, using them to gauge the presence of moisture or access points in walls. The coexistence of human and rodent life in such close quarters created an odd, if uneasy, rhythm to each night. Whispers of wind entering through tiny cracks in windows or doorways create fleeting currents that flutter across the floor and walls. You feel these drafts brush your skin, a subtle but constant reminder of the cold beyond. The air shifts unpredictably, carrying faint scents from other chambers, or from the outside, blending with the damp, earthy smell that dominates the pool. You notice how every breath you take is influenced by these movements, each inhalation a mixture of air and memory, a reflection of human and architectural interaction. A strange detail emerges as you focus on the soundscape. The dripping of water occasionally interacts with rough patches of stone to create a tonal difference, producing a high-pitched plink one moment and a muted plop the next. Chroniclers recount that some prisoners would mentally track these variations, creating improvised rhythms or games to pass the long, cold hours. This minor auditory engagement could provide distraction, a mental exercise in a place where physical activity was limited and monotony dominated. Footsteps on uneven floors produce their own pattern. You notice the subtle difference between a step landing on smooth stone, roughened surfaces, or residual straw. Each creates a distinct sound, and a prisoner navigating at night would be acutely aware of these differences, learning instinctively how to move quietly or efficiently. The interplay between sound and material shapes movement as much as comfort, reinforcing the environment's influence on both body and mind. The dungeon amplifies subtle sensory details. A faint tap on stone may startle the imagination, leading to imagined conversations, whispered warnings, or memories of previous prisoners. The mind fills gaps in auditory perception, creating a rich, immersive awareness that keeps a prisoner engaged and alert. You feel how this constant sensory input makes the environment feel alive, its rhythms both oppressive and oddly captivating. Occasional larger sounds punctuate the monotony. A door rattles, a chain swings, or distant voices carry faintly through corridors. Each interruption offers a momentary reminder of human presence and activity outside the cell. Some historical texts suggest that these noises could provide comfort, evidence of life beyond confinement, or intensify unease by reminding prisoners of their isolation. The emotional effect depends on interpretation, demonstrating how the environment interacts subtly with perception and psychology. Moisture influences the way sound travels. Drips and echoes become softer or sharper depending on the humidity in the air, and puddles can alter the pitch when struck by falling drops. Prisoners had to become attuned to these nuances, sometimes using them as cues to anticipate changes in temperature or water levels. The dungeon environment required constant mental engagement, a persistent awareness that was both necessary for survival and mentally taxing. You notice that the rhythmic drip of water, combined with the scurrying of rats, creates a layered auditory experience. Each element interacts unpredictably, producing patterns that are never entirely repetitive. You imagine a prisoner listening intently, finding slight variations that could be catalogued in the mind, almost like a private symphony of endurance. The interaction between environment and perception highlights how subtle details shaped daily existence, where survival required constant adjustment. The architecture amplifies echoes, turning minor noises into more significant auditory cues. A faint rustle of straw may sound like movement elsewhere. A drip from a nearby ceiling can echo as if it originates from a distant chamber. These effects contribute to heightened alertness, a necessary adaptation for life in isolation and cold. You feel the same awareness as you walk through the chamber, every sound commanding attention, every nuance shaping perception. In some chambers, water dripped directly onto stone, creating small splashes that momentarily fractured the air with noise. Some prisoners reportedly learned to predict these occurrences, timing their movements or adjusting their bedding to avoid sudden splashes. The interaction between sound, moisture, and space demonstrates how even minor elements could dictate patterns of behavior, subtly shaping every action. The combination of sound, moisture, and drafts creates an almost hypnotic effect. You notice how repetitive elements, like dripping water, can lull the mind into a heightened state of awareness or light sleep, though never fully rest. Historical observers suggest that prisoners sometimes became sensitive to every nuance of the environment, identifying which drips indicated leaks, which drafts carried scents, and which sounds predicted the approach of guards or other prisoners. Footfalls, whispers of wind, and the scuttling of small animals form a continuous sensory background. You notice how these sounds interact with your own presence, echoing and blending to create a living, breathing environment. Even in silence, the dungeon communicates through residual echoes and subtle movements, making every sound significant and every moment a careful negotiation with space. The interplay between sound and darkness shapes mental perception. Shadows may hide mimar movement, while echoes distort it, forcing the mind to constantly interpret and reassess. Some chroniclers report that prisoners developed remarkable auditory acuity, distinguishing between different types of steps, drops, and rustles. This heightened sensitivity became both a survival mechanism and a source of mental fatigue, a constant engagement of attention even when the body sought rest. Curiously, the presence of animals introduces irregularity. Rats, insects, and occasional stray birds interact with water, stone, and straw, producing unpredictable sounds. You feel how the mind learns patterns, yet remains alert to disruptions, a balancing act between anticipation and adaptation. These interactions remind you that the dungeon is inhabited in more ways than one, a shared space between humans and creatures that have adapted alongside them. Finally, you pause and listen to the totality of the environment. Every drop, every scurry, every draft combines to form a rich, immersive experience. The dungeon teaches awareness, patience, and adaptability, shaping not only the body but the mind. You feel how each sound interacts with cold, moisture, and shadow, guiding perception and subtly enforcing endurance. In this place, the act of listening is inseparable from survival, and every noise becomes part of a nightly ritual of consciousness. The dungeon's darkness is profound, enveloping you completely as you move further inside. Even the faint flicker of a torch struggles to penetrate corners and recesses, leaving shadows that twist in unexpected ways. Accounts from the period describe how prisoners often lost track of time entirely, with nights blending seamlessly into days. The absence of light heightens every other sense, making the body hyper-aware of cold, moisture, and subtle sounds. You notice how the mind begins to invent movement or voices, filling the gaps created by obscured vision, a natural response to prolonged darkness. You pause near a narrow window slit, where only a thin line of light touches the floor. Evidence suggests that such openings were designed primarily for ventilation rather than illumination. You feel the chill that seeps through, even when your hands are pressed against the stone, and imagine how tiny glimmers of sunlight might have been treasured by those who spent months without exposure. In some regions, chroniclers noted that prisoners track the position of the sun through these slits to mark the passage of days, a subtle strategy to maintain orientation and sanity. The dungeon's architecture reinforces isolation. Corridors twist and intersect unpredictably, creating pockets of space that seem disconnected from one another. Some historians maintain that these layouts were intentional, designed to prevent communication and reduce the sense of control prisoners might feel. Others argue that the irregular design was simply a byproduct of construction limitations or the use of pre-existing structures. The uncertainty in interpretation reflects the broader challenge of understanding the psychological impact of these spaces. Interestingly, some accounts suggest that prisoners developed methods to cope with extreme darkness. Whispering to themselves, recounting prayer, or tracing patterns in the stage with the fingertips became ways to anchor perception. Such behaviors reveal a remarkable adaptation to environmental deprivation. You feel how the combination of darkness and isolation shapes awareness, forcing the mind to focus inward and heightening sensitivity to every tiny sensation around you. Moisture and cold are amplified by lack of light. The stone walls retain dampness, which condenses on skin and clothing, sending subtle shivers through the body. Evidence indicates that some prisoners learn to position themselves against particular walls to minimize exposure to drafts. You notice how the body instinctively reacts to cold, curling limbs and pressing closer to surfaces that offer even minimal warmth. Adaptation becomes second nature when comfort is scarce. The sounds of the dungeon take on new significance in the absence of visual cues. Water drips, chains rattle, and rodents scurry, each noise magnified and interpreted as a potential signal. Some contemporary sources mention that prisoners would assign meaning to these sounds, using them as a makeshift clock or alert system. The brain, deprived of visual input, becomes intensely attuned to auditory information, blending perception and imagination in a delicate balance between awareness and mental fatigue. Oddly, there are reports of prisoners using subtle light patterns to communicate. A reflection from a polished stone or a faint torch flicker could serve as a signal between cells. These improvised communications are rare, but demonstrate ingenuity in constrained conditions. You imagine the careful observation required, noticing nuances in darkness that would otherwise be invisible, an exercise in patience and perception. Temperature fluctuations within the dungeon are subtle yet constant. Stone surfaces may retain slight residual warmth from the day, while air currents through narrow openings bring bursts of icy draft. Accounts describe prisoners learning to read these microclimates, adjusting posture, clothing, or location to conserve heat. The combination of observation, intuition, and small physical adjustments forms a continuous negotiation with the environment. Evidence suggests that the lack of light also influenced sleep patterns. Without natural cues from the sun, circadian rhythms became erratic. Some chroniclers report that prisoners would sleep in brief intervals, waking frequently to adjust to cold or moisture. The interplay of darkness, sensory deprivation, and environmental stress created a cyclical pattern of light and restlessness. Reinforcing the physical and mental challenges of life in confinement, you notice how shadows seem to take on forms that spark imagination. Even a minor irregularity in stone can appear as a movement or figure in low light. Some texts describe prisoners attributing these illusions to spirits or divine observation, reflecting how isolation and darkness amplify perception and influence mental states. These subtle psychological effects compound the physical discomfort, creating a pervasive awareness that demands attention even while the body seeks rest. Moisture interacts with darkness in unexpected ways. Condensation collects on rough stone, dripping intermittently, producing unpredictable sounds. You imagine prisoners learning to anticipate these variations, timing movements or adjusting bedding to avoid sudden dampness. These practices reveal an intimate, almost instinctive understanding of the environment. Blending physical sensation with attentive observation, the confined space magnifies every sensation. A faint draft, a distant noise, or the touch of damp fabric becomes immediate and pressing. Chroniclers note that prisoners often describe nights as endless, with heightened awareness making even small discomforts intolerable. You notice how attention to minor details is necessary, a skill cultivated by necessity rather than choice. where survival depends on acute perception of surroundings. Curiously, some sources mention that prisoners would trace patterns along the walls with fingertips to orient themselves in darkness. This tactile engagement served both practical and psychological purposes, providing reference points and a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable environment. Such practices underscore the human capacity for adaptation even under prolonged deprivation. The absence of visual stimulation also altered emotional states. Loneliness, fear, and anticipation of the unknown intensified in darkness. Evidence indicates that prisoners sometimes created mental narratives, recounting past events or imagining future outcomes as a form of coping. The mind became both companion and adversary, filling the void with memory and imagination. Even the placement of chains, doorways, and niches contributed to the sense of isolation. Narrow gaps blocked sightlines, and deep recesses obscured the movements of guards or fellow prisoners. Some architectural features may have been designed deliberately to reinforce psychological pressure. Although interpretations vary, the precise intent remains uncertain, reflecting the complexity of medieval dungeon design. Small rituals became important in this environment, adjusting straw, layering clothing, or methodically counting drips of water offered structure to otherwise chaotic sensory input. Chroniclers note that these routines, though minor, provided a sense of order and predictability, anchoring prisoners to tangible actions amidst pervasive darkness and uncertainty. You notice how darkness sharpens awareness of body and environment. Touch, temperature, and subtle sounds dominate perception, guiding movement and behavior. Even slight changes in draft or moisture are immediately noticed. Survival becomes a continuous dialogue between self and space, where adaptation and attentiveness are essential. Oddly, some accounts suggest that prisoners would whisper to themselves to combat isolation. Repetition of phrases, prayers, or chants served as auditory anchors, a way to create structure within the endless night. These self-generated sounds highlight the interplay between environment, perception, and psychological resilience. Finally, as you settle against the cold stone and low light, you realize how profoundly the absence of illumination shapes experience. Every sensation, sound, touch, and smell is heightened, while imagination fills the gaps, creating a vivid and sometimes unsettling awareness. Darkness is both oppressive and revealing, demanding attention, fostering adaptation, and teaching endurance in a space that offers little else. The cold in the dungeon does not simply touch the surface, it penetrates the very marrow of the body. You feel it creeping up your legs, seeping through layers of thin fabric, settling into joints, and settling into muscles that ache from the chill. Accounts from the period describe prisoners huddling against walls or curling into corners in an attempt to retain warmth. Though these positions often led to stiffness or cramps, every movement feels deliberate, as if each shift of weight could either conserve heat or allow it to escape. The body learns to respond instinctively, balancing discomfort with fleeting relief. Stone walls absorb what little heat is available and release it unpredictably. You notice that even when a small ember glows nearby, the warmth radiates unevenly, leaving extremities chilled. Evidence suggests that prisoners quickly became adept at finding small microclimates within the cell, areas where residual heat might linger or drafts might be minimal. The process required constant observation and adaptation, and even slight miscalculations could result in hours of intensified discomfort. Curiously, some chroniclers mention that prisoners would press their hands or feet against walls to gauge temperature changes, adjusting positions as needed. This interaction with the environment was both practical and meditative, forcing attention to subtle cues in stone, air, and temperature. The act of listening to one's body while monitoring the surroundings creates a rhythm, a quiet engagement that extends into the night. The persistent dampness contributes to the sensation of cold in ways you may not anticipate. Moisture clings to clothing, bedding, and skin, increasing thermal conductivity and making even small drafts feel sharp. Some accounts indicate that prisoners would periodically adjust bedding or clothing to mitigate these effects, a minor ritual repeated nightly. The tactile feedback from damp straw, wet stone, and cold fabric informs every movement and posture, guiding survival through attention to detail. Footsteps, shifting chains, and distant echoes combine with the cold to heighten awareness. You notice how the mind begins to amplify minor sounds, interpreting them as potential threats or markers of nearby presence. In such darkness, every noise carries significance. Accounts from the period describe prisoners mentally cataloguing the cadence of drips, the direction of echoes, and the pattern of shifting animals to anticipate changes in the environment. These adaptations highlight the subtle intelligence required to endure physically harsh conditions. Interestingly, the cold itself influences sleep cycles. Even with attempts to rest, shivering and discomfort force the body to remain partially alert. Some records suggest that prisoners alternated between curling tightly for warmth and stretching slightly to relieve pressure points, creating a fragmented pattern of rest. The interplay between physical response and environmental challenge shapes not only endurance, but perception of time. You notice how hours stretch, marked by discomfort rather than sunlight or clocks. Stone floors retain moisture, subtly changing sensation as you move. Puddles and damp patches create micro-variations in cold, requiring constant adjustment. Evidence indicates that prisoners learn to identify slightly warmer areas, adjusting sleeping positions or shifting bedding to take advantage of these subtle differences. Small acts of ingenuity become essential for endurance. You sense that the dungeon imposes a constant feedback loop between body and environment. Cold intensifies awareness, and awareness informs adaptation. Even minor environmental cues, such as a subtle draft or a slight shift in moisture, require an immediate response. Chroniclers note that those who survived longer often developed heightened sensitivity, an intimate understanding of their surroundings that guided behavior through repeated exposure. Oddly, some prisoners created mental exercises to distract from cold, counting, reciting poetry, or tracing patterns in the stone with fingertips offered a form of cognitive insulation against discomfort. These practices demonstrate how mental engagement became inseparable from physical survival, a way to endure nights that might otherwise feel unbearable. You notice how clothing and small personal items could influence comfort. Thin layers offered some insulation, but when wet from drafts or condensation, they often intensified the cold. Some historical records describe prisoners layering fabric strategically or tucking rags into garments to create additional barriers against damp stones. Even minor adjustments offered critical relief, revealing the importance of small, deliberate actions. Temperature variations within the dungeon are not uniform. Air currents, residual heat in walls, and subtle drafts create constant shifts in sensation. Prisoners adapted by learning which positions minimized exposure and maximized retained warmth. You feel how instinctive this awareness becomes, guiding subtle postural changes or strategic placement within the cell. Adaptation is both reactive and anticipatory. The cold interacts with sound as well. Shivering amplifies rustling noises from straw or clothing, while echoes in corridors make distant sounds seem closer. Some sources mention that prisoners used these amplified noises to anticipate the approach of guards or other individuals, a form of situational awareness that blends environmental cues with human ingenuity. Even tactile perception is heightened. The rough stone beneath you, the uneven floor, and the cold air against your skin all communicate the state of the environment. Prisoners learn to interpret these sensations as signals, adjusting posture, clothing, and activity to preserve energy and warmth. You sense how finely tuned awareness becomes under sustained discomfort. Curiously, some prisoners would press their backs against slightly warmer walls or seek out corners where drafts were minimal. These minor interventions were often the only opportunity to retain even a trace of warmth. Historical accounts suggest that such behavior was widespread, demonstrating an instinctive understanding of the dungeon's microclimates. The interplay between cold, moisture, and human adaptation is subtle yet profound. You notice how each sensation influences perception, movement, and endurance. Chroniclers from the era describe nights where survival depended not only on physical resilience, but also on the ability to anticipate and respond to environmental changes. The cold becomes both adversary and teacher. Even in rest, the body reacts constantly. Fingers and toes curl, muscles tense and relax, and slight movements are made to adjust to floor and air conditions. Accounts indicate that prisoners developed routines almost unconsciously, repeating small postural adjustments throughout the night. You feel the rhythm of this survival, an intimate dance between perception and endurance. Interestingly, some sources note that prisoners would use their breath to gauge air currents, inhaling carefully to detect subtle temperature changes. This practice exemplifies how acute sensory awareness became a survival tool, a form of environmental literacy learned through prolonged exposure. Finally, as you sit quietly in this cold, damp chamber, you notice how every detail, temperature, moisture, sound, and texture contributes to a heightened state of awareness. The environment is never passive. It shapes behavior, perception, and endurance in ways both subtle and profound. The dungeon teaches patience, adaptation, and a quiet understanding of how human resilience interacts with space and sensation. The damp air in the dungeon fosters illnesses that creep slowly but persistently. Evidence from medieval records shows that prisoners were particularly vulnerable to chills, fevers, and respiratory ailments. Even minor exposure to cold and moisture over weeks could weaken the body, making it more susceptible to infections. You feel how the lingering humidity in every corner can carry subtle reminders of these dangers, pressing against skin, seeping through fabric, and making each breath a negotiation with the environment. Interestingly, some accounts suggest that certain areas of the dungeon were worse than others for sickness. Low-lying chambers often collected cold drafts and moisture, creating pockets where shivers persisted despite any small fire or cloak. Other spaces, slightly elevated or near a narrow window, allowed minimal airflow that could reduce stagnation but increased exposure to icy gusts. You notice how prisoners had to learn the nuances of their immediate surroundings, discovering which spots offered the least risk of exacerbating illness. Medical knowledge was limited, and remedies were scarce. Contemporary chronicles describe the use of simple herbs, poultices, or warm water when available. But these were exceptional. You imagine a prisoner attempting to stave off chills with small tricks, pressing against walls, curling tightly in corners, or layering scraps of clothing to trap heat. Such adaptations were born of necessity rather than choice, demonstrating ingenuity in a world with minimal resources. The dungeon's architecture amplified the spread of disease. Stone walls absorbed moisture, creating persistent dampness that encouraged mold and bacterial growth. Foot traffic, occasional animals, and the accumulation of waste further contributed to unsanitary conditions. Historical records reveal that prisoners often suffered from rashes, respiratory distress, or joint aches, their bodies continually challenged by both environmental and biological factors. Oddly, some prisoners developed rituals around hygiene within these constraints. A few accounts note that they would carefully scrape away mouldy straw, move bedding to drier spots, or even collect small amounts of fresh water to rinse hands and face. These acts, though minimal, provided a psychological sense of control, helping to counter feelings of helplessness in a space dominated by cold and disease. You notice how physical discomfort interacts with mental strain. A persistent chill can intensify anxiety, making small sounds or shadows feel more threatening. Medieval chronicles describe prisoners becoming increasingly irritable or withdrawn after long periods, demonstrating how the combination of environmental stresses affects mood and perception. The dungeon's cold, damp air becomes not just a physical challenge but a psychological one, influencing every thought and sensation. Some sources mention that prisoners who survived extended stays often became adept at detecting subtle temperature changes. They would sense drafts, identify warmer patches of stone, and move bedding strategically. This heightened environmental awareness, born of necessity, allowed them to mitigate illness and discomfort, highlighting human adaptability even under extreme conditions. The interplay of moisture, cold, and stagnant air also affected sleep quality. A damp pillow or cold floor could lead to frequent awakenings, muscle cramps, and restless nights. You imagine a prisoner turning carefully to avoid puddles, adjusting layers of straw and fabric, or curling tightly to conserve warmth. Each minor action is a survival technique, practiced nightly, creating a rhythm of endurance and adaptation that becomes almost instinctive over time. Curiously, chroniclers note that some prisoners would use body heat cooperatively, lying close to companions to share warmth. While this offered slight relief, it also required trust, and in some cases, such proximity increased the risk of illness. The tension between seeking comfort and avoiding further harm illustrates the delicate balance prisoners maintained, navigating both environmental and social challenges. Temperature fluctuations within the dungeon could exacerbate illness. A slight rise in heat from a dying torch might be welcome for a moment, only to be replaced by a sudden icy draft as the fire waned. Accounts suggest that prisoners learned to anticipate these shifts, adjusting position or clothing preemptively to reduce discomfort. The dungeon itself becomes a teacher, providing lessons through observation and experience about resilience in extreme conditions. The smell of damp straw and stone could serve as both a warning and a reassurance. Faint odours indicated moisture accumulation or stagnant areas that might worsen cold-related ailments. Yet the same smells also confirmed the presence of familiar surroundings, small constants in an environment designed to erode comfort. You feel how sensory cues, however subtle, guide both movement and psychological response. Evidence indicates that prisoners developed techniques to maintain circulation. Stretching, shifting, or lightly pressing against warmer surfaces helped mitigate the effects of persistent cold. Such behaviours are noted sporadically in chronicles, suggesting that survival depended on learning and repeating small adaptations over weeks or months. The body and mind, working together, negotiate a fragile equilibrium within the dungeon's constraints. Oddly, some accounts report that prisoners would use repetitive mental exercises to endure discomfort, such as reciting prayers, counting, or rehearsing stories. These strategies distracted from physical pain and reinforced focus, helping to maintain alertness and prevent despair. The combination of mental and physical coping mechanisms highlights human ingenuity in enduring harsh conditions. The cold and dampness influenced not only daily routines but also personal habits. Prisoners carefully managed limited bedding and clothing, rotating wet layers to dry areas, or insulating key parts of the body with rags. Evidence suggests that these small acts of resourcefulness were critical for maintaining health and comfort. You notice how intimately survival is tied to attention, observation, and foresight. The environment's challenges were compounded by isolation. The absence of sunlight, companionship, and proper ventilation increased susceptibility to illness, while mental strain heightened perception of every discomfort. Chroniclers describe prisoners feeling constantly aware of cold surfaces, moisture, and subtle air currents. Awareness becomes both a necessity and a burden, shaping each movement, thought, and sensation throughout the night. Interestingly, some prisoners created minor inventions to counter the chill. Small arrangements of straw, cloth, or wood could improve insulation, creating tiny pockets of warmth that might be preserved throughout the night. These improvisations, though modest, demonstrate creativity and adaptation under extreme constraints. You notice how the combined effects of cold, moisture, and poor nutrition amplify one another. Weakness from sparse food makes shivering more intense, and damp clothing accelerates heat loss. Historical records describe prisoners experiencing cumulative fatigue, where nights of cold directly impacted daytime endurance, health, and psychological stability. Even minor adjustments to posture were significant. Lying curled to conserve warmth, elevating feet to avoid cold floors, or pressing hands against walls all contributed to marginally improved comfort. Each movement required careful judgment, balancing the immediate relief against potential consequences. Finally, as you observe the room in quiet reflection, you realize that the dungeon's persistent cold and dampness is more than physical discomfort. It is a complex system that shapes perception, endurance, and adaptation. You feel how every sensation, temperature, moisture, smell, and texture interacts to create an immersive environment that tests the body and mind, teaching subtle lessons about resilience in extreme conditions. Food in the dungeon was minimal, often cold, and rarely nutritious. Records from the era indicate that prisoners received small portions of bread, watery gruel, or thin soup, barely sufficient to sustain energy. You imagine holding a small bowl in your hands, feeling the warmth dissipate quickly, and realizing that each bite only slightly staves off the gnawing sensation of hunger. Even the act of eating provides little comfort, as the cold seeps in simultaneously, chilling hands and body while the stomach protests. Interestingly, some chroniclers describe creative methods prisoners used to stretch meagre rations. A few collected tiny scraps from previous meals, mixed stale bread with water, or soaked hard bits to soften them. These efforts reveal both ingenuity and desperation, a constant negotiation with scarcity that underscores how basic sustenance became a daily challenge. You notice how every morsel must be conserved, not only for physical survival but also to maintain mental resilience. Evidence suggests that hunger was compounded by the dungeon's cold. A chilled body burns calories more quickly as it attempts to maintain core temperature. Accounts note that prisoners shivered while eating, their stomachs contracting with both cold and hunger, making meals simultaneously necessary and uncomfortable. You can almost feel the subtle tension between the need to nourish the body and the effort to retain warmth, a constant negotiation dictated by environment and circumstance. Some sources indicate that food was delivered sporadically, often by guards whose own priorities and mood affected timing. Oddly, the anticipation of arrival could create both hope and anxiety. A prisoner listening for footsteps or the clinking of a bucket might prepare mentally for a moment of brief relief, only to face disappointment if the portion was smaller than expected. The psychology of expectation mingles with physical need, shaping how prisoners experienced both time and sustenance. Accounts from contemporary observers note that diet variety was extremely limited. Bread was often stale, soup thin, and water sometimes contaminated. Some prisoners relied on scavenging from the cell floor, though this carried risks of illness or punishment. You notice how scarcity imposed both creativity and caution, demanding constant awareness of surroundings and an intimate understanding of the microenvironment to avoid danger while attempting to eat. Curiously, a few sources suggest that prisoners sometimes traded bits of food among themselves, establishing small networks of exchange and cooperation. These interactions, though minor, provided not only sustenance but also a psychological connection, a reminder that humans are capable of adaptation and mutual support even under extreme deprivation. You can imagine the subtle negotiations that accompanied the sharing of bread or soup, small gestures loaded with significance. The impact of poor nutrition extends beyond immediate hunger. Accounts describe fatigue, weakness, and irritability, which compounded the challenges posed by cold, moisture, and isolation. Prisoners with limited energy struggle to adjust to environmental discomfort, creating a cycle where physical deprivation intensified exposure-related suffering. You feel how intertwined the effects of diet and environment are, each influencing perception, endurance, and morale. Records indicate that occasional deliveries of slightly better provisions occurred, often tied to special occasions or bribes. These rare moments of relief created spikes in hope and comfort, but their unpredictability also heightened the sense of instability. A prisoner might experience fleeting satisfaction, immediately replaced by awareness of scarcity and cold. The contrast between rare warmth and persistent deprivation magnifies the challenge of remaining resilient. Interestingly, some prisoners develop small rituals around food, carefully breaking bread into smaller pieces, washing utensils meticulously, or sipping soup slowly became acts of mindfulness, a way to assert control in an otherwise controlled environment. You notice how these seemingly minor practices contribute to a sense of agency, a psychological buffer against pervasive helplessness. Evidence suggests that hunger sometimes interacted with social dynamics. Prisoners with access to slightly larger portions might use their surplus strategically, exchanging it for favors or protection. Accounts reveal subtle hierarchies and informal economies emerging even within the harshest confines, illustrating how survival depended on both physical and social adaptation. The combination of sparse food and persistent cold amplifies physical sensations. You can feel your body instinctively attempting to conserve energy, shivering to generate heat while coping with the hollow feeling in your stomach. Chroniclers note that long-term exposure to such conditions weakened immune systems, slowed recovery from minor injuries, and intensified fatigue. Hunger and cold together became a constant, intertwined trial for body and mind. Oddly, some prisoners became adept at recognizing even minor nutritional improvements. A slightly firmer loaf or thicker broth could signal a temporary change in provision quality. Observing these subtle differences required attention and memory, further engaging the mind in a space that offered few distractions. You sense how heightened awareness of such details becomes necessary for endurance. Accounts indicate that some prisoners took comfort in ritualized eating, repeating gestures, or praying before meals, even in the bleakest circumstances. Small routines offered psychological stability, a structured interaction with an otherwise chaotic environment. You notice how these rituals reinforce a sense of control, however modest, and case of extreme or deprivor. Researchers have offered contrasting views on the influence of diet on prisoner survival. Some assert that even minimal nutrition could sustain life if combined with careful conservation of energy, while others emphasize the cumulative impact of cold, dampness, and repeated hunger. The evidence suggests that endurance depended on a mixture of physiological resilience and behavioral adaptation. You notice that mealtime also interacted with environmental discomfort. The act of eating could expose hands to cold, breath to drafts, and the body to damp floors. Every movement required negotiation with temperature, moisture, and posture, reinforcing the constant need for alertness even during basic activities. Curiously, some accounts describe prisoners saving small portions for later, using them as psychological leverage against despair. These morsels became symbols of hope, small victories in a world defined by deprivation, even when actual nourishment was minimal. The act of planning or conserving food offered a sense of agency. The anticipation of meals influenced perception of time, listening for footsteps, estimating intervals between deliveries, and mentally preparing for ration distribution shaped daily experience. Chroniclers describe how these temporal markers became central to prisoners' routines, structuring attention and expectation in an otherwise unstructured environment. Food scarcity also influenced interactions between prisoners. Limited resources could spark tension or cooperation, requiring judgment, negotiation, and sometimes compromise. Accounts reveal that social dynamics intertwined closely with survival strategies, where sharing or withholding food carried both practical and symbolic weight. Finally, as you imagine sitting quietly with a thin bowl of gruel, you realize how profoundly minimal sustenance affects body, mind, and perception. Each bite is more than nutrition. It is a fleeting moment of comfort, a psychological reprieve, and a subtle engagement with the environment. The dungeon teaches that even the smallest allowances of nourishment become critical to endurance and the quiet cultivation of resilience. The psychological strain in a dungeon is as palpable as the cold or dampness. Records from the period describe prisoners experiencing intense anxiety, restlessness, and bouts of despair. You notice how the mind amplifies every sensation, turning the drip of water, the skitter of a rat, or a distant creak into a source of tension. Isolation magnifies these effects, making even minor discomforts feel overwhelming. You feel how your own awareness of the space might shift, as though each movement, sound, and shadow carries significance far beyond its physical presence. Interestingly, chroniclers describe small coping mechanisms that prisoners developed to manage mental strain. Whispering prayers, repeating phrases, or silently recounting memories became tools for focus and endurance. These actions, though subtle, helped anchor attention, offering structure in a place where time and routine were otherwise uncertain. You notice how such rituals create a rhythm of mental engagement, balancing the oppressive sensory environment with small acts of control. The dungeon's architecture reinforces psychological tension. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, and convoluted passageways restrict movement and visibility. Evidence from contemporary sources suggests that these design elements were sometimes intended to prevent communication between prisoners and maintain a sense of isolation. You feel the effect immediately. The space itself constrains and manipulates perception, turning simple movements into calculated acts. Curiously, some accounts indicate that prisoners develop ways to create mental maps of their cells and corridors. By memorizing dimensions, corners, and obstacles, they could navigate in near total darkness without injury. This practice required intense observation and attention to subtle details, demonstrating how necessity sharpen cognitive faculties even in extreme discomfort. You notice how the mind adapts, translating physical hardship into acute awareness and soft skills. Emotional strain was often intertwined with physical discomfort. Cold, hunger, and dampness heightened sensitivity to fear, loneliness, and uncertainty. Accounts note that prisoners sometimes experienced hallucinations or imagined conversations in response to prolonged isolation. You feel how every sensation becomes layered with meaning, and how the environment encourages mental vigilance even as the body seeks rest. The presence of other prisoners influenced psychological experience. Records indicate that occasional interactions, whether cooperative or tense, could alter perception of space and time. A whispered conversation or shared strategy for warmth might offer relief, while disputes over scarce resources could intensify stress. You notice how social dynamics, though limited, remain a critical factor in mental endurance. Accounts also describe creative forms of self-entertainment that alleviated mental strain, reciting poetry, singing quietly, or mentally rehearsing strees provided cognitive engagement and distraction from discomfort. These activities reveal the human capacity to generate psychological comfort independently of material conditions. Or you notice how even in an austere old space, the mind seeks stimulation to maintain resilience. There is evidence that prisoners became acutely aware of temporal patterns. Subtle changes in light, sound, or temperature were used to track the passage of hours or anticipate the arrival of guards and meals. Oddly, some prisoners even counted drips of water or footsteps as markers of time, creating improvised routines to impose structure on otherwise chaotic nights. You feel how these adaptations blend mental focus with environmental perception. Chroniclers also mention that persistent discomfort could alter sleep patterns, fragmented rest, interrupted by cold, dampness, and anxiety, contributed to fatigue and heightened sensitivity. You notice how sleeplessness intensifies both perception and reaction to minor stimuli, creating a feedback loop where awareness and vigilance are continuously reinforced. Curiously, some sources suggest that prisoners develop subtle tactile rituals to maintain mental engagement, tracing patterns or stone walls, rearranging straw bedding, or tapping rhythms with fingers offered focus and a sense of agency. These small, repeated acts were a way to negotiate the environment psychologically, providing mental relief in a space designed to suppress comfort. Evidence indicates that enduring long periods in such conditions required both cognitive and emotional strategies. Mental resilience became as crucial as physical adaptation. Accounts describe prisoners cultivating patience, observing environmental cues closely, and using imagination to maintain morale. You notice how these strategies shape perception and behavior, emphasizing the integration of mind and body in survival. Some historical sources describe the use of repetitive thought as a coping mechanism. Reciting prayers, recounting events from the day, or silently rehearsing familiar texts served to occupy attention and mitigate anxiety. These methods illustrate the subtle interplay between cognition, attention, and endurance. You feel how mental focus can transform passive suffering into active engagement with the environment. The physical environment amplifies psychological pressure. Persistent cold, dampness, and darkness intensify feelings of isolation and vulnerability. You notice how every stone surface, every draft, and every echo shapes the mind's perception of the dungeon, influencing both emotional state and behavior. Adaptation becomes a constant dialogue between inner awareness and external conditions. Oddly, chroniclers note that prisoners sometimes created imaginary companions or conversations as a means of maintaining sanity. Engaging with these mental constructs allowed attention to remain occupied and provided comfort, however fleeting. You notice how imagination becomes a vital tool for resilience, offering relief from both physical and emotional stressors. Records suggest that some prisoners use small rituals to divide the night into manageable segments. Checking straw, shifting position, or even touching walls at intervals created a sense of control and measured time in a seemingly endless night. These structured behaviors mitigated feelings of helplessness, reinforcing both endurance and psychological stability. You notice how sensory input shapes emotional responses. Every sound, touch, and smell becomes more pronounced, each echo of movement or draft triggering heightened awareness. Chroniclers describe how prisoners adapted by developing acute attention to environmental cues, refining perception to manage both physical and psychological challenges. Interestingly, some accounts report that maintaining focus on minor tasks or routines helped prisoners survive prolonged periods of isolation. Whether folding straw, arranging cloth, or tracing wall surfaces, these actions created continuity, structure, and purpose in an otherwise unpredictable environment. You notice how even minimal agency strengthens resilience and helps regulate emotional responses. Finally, as you sit quietly in the cold, damp chamber, you sense how the psychological experience of confinement is inseparable from physical conditions. Isolation, darkness, and discomfort shape perception, focus, and endurance, teaching lessons in patience, awareness, and subtle adaptation. The mind becomes both a refuge and a tool, guiding the body through an environment that challenges every sense and every instinct for comfort. The dungeon contained devices both practical and puzzling. Records from the medieval period describe simple iron restraints, metal bars, and mechanisms designed to restrict movement or enforce control. You notice how these implements interacted with space, amplifying discomfort even in the absence of active punishment. A prisoner lying near chains would feel their presence continuously, an unyielding reminder of confinement that shaped posture, sleep, and subtle body movements. Interestingly, some sources mention unusual contraptions whose purpose is debated. One account describes a low iron frame that might have been used to restrict posture or force endurance of certain positions. Interpretation varies, with some historians suggesting it served as a training device, while others believe it was intended purely to punish. You feel how these ambiguities add to the sense of unpredictability and psychological pressure within the dungeon. The sensory impact of such devices is subtle but persistent. The cold metal contrasts sharply with rough stone, chilling skin even when lying on straw bedding. Accounts indicate that prisoners instinctively adjusted position to avoid prolonged contact, learning to negotiate between the discomfort of stone and the bite of iron. You notice how such adaptations require constant awareness, linking physical sensation with mental calculation. Curiously, some records mention that prisoners used these devices to mark time or record presence. Scratches on iron bars or impressions in adjacent walls suggest attempts to leave a trace of existence. Small acts of agency in an environment designed to erase individuality. You imagine the tactile attention required, tracing surfaces to understand the tools that both restrained and defined daily life. Evidence from contemporary sources indicates that the layout of restraints often dictated movement patterns. Narrow spaces combined with chains or bars made shifting, stretching, or repositioning essential to comfort and health. You feel how the body learns to navigate constraints subtly, balancing pressure points and circulation while minimizing exposure to cold surfaces. An unusual observation is that some prisoners reportedly use the chains or bars to support themselves for brief exercises. Stretching arms, pressing feet, or gently shifting weight could provide minor relief from stiffness, although such actions had to be cautious to avoid injury or drawing attention. You notice how ingenuity transforms even punitive objects into tools for endurance. Experts differ regarding the prevalence of such devices across dungeons. Some argue they were standard features designed to enforce compliance, while others suggest they were rare and idiosyncratic, reflecting the particular whims of castle authorities. This uncertainty reinforces the sense that prisoners had to adapt continuously, responding to both known and unpredictable elements of their environment. You notice how sound interacts with metal and stone, chains scrape, clink, or echo when moved, sometimes startling the mind, other times providing rhythm to which the body unconsciously adjusts. Chroniclers note that these sounds could heighten tension or serve as markers of time, blending practical function with psychological effect. Oddly, some accounts describe prisoners using chains to create minor signals or communications. A soft tug, subtle movement, or gentle clink could indicate presence or alert a fellow inmate. These adaptations, though limited, illustrate human ingenuity in navigating restrictive environments. You sense how even objects designed for discomfort can be co-opted for resilience. Documentation from the period suggests that metal restraints often exacerbated injuries. Cold and pressure contributed to numbness, bruising, or muscle strain, particularly when used in conjunction with stone floors and limited bedding. You notice how the body continuously negotiates between surfaces, materials, and posture, requiring constant attention even during attempted rest. Curiously, some chronicles describe prisoners interpreting the arrangement of devices as part of a ritualized environment. Repeated interaction with chains, bars, and iron frames shaped routines, from careful positioning to deliberate movements. These actions illustrate the subtle interplay between adaptation and environmental design, blending physical necessity with mental patterns. Accounts indicate that some prisoners modified their contact with metal subtly, wrapping scraps of cloth, adjusting posture, or using bedding as the insulation, allowed slight relief from cold and pressure. You notice how these improvisations demonstrate practical intelligence, a careful response to continuous, unavoidable discomfort. The presence of metal in the environment amplified sound and temperature perception. Every scrape or touch was sharper, every draft or shift of air more noticeable. Contemporary sources describe heightened sensitivity, where prisoners learn to anticipate environmental changes through tactile feedback, integrating perception and survival instinct. Oddly, some prisoners reportedly use the chains for self-expression, etching small marks or initials where possible. This practice, while subtle, reflected a desire to assert identity and leave a trace in a space designed to erase individuality. You sense how tactile engagement merges physical interaction with psychological coping. Interpretations vary regarding the intention behind these devices. Some suggest purely disciplinary purposes, others argue they encouraged endurance or compliance. You notice how this ambiguity contributes to the mental challenge. Creating uncertainty and requiring constant vigilance, survival depends on attention, adaptation, and anticipation. Records also indicate that guards often use devices to enforce routines or punish minor infractions. You imagine the tension this introduced, as even small movements could be constrained or monitored, adding psychological weight to physical discomfort. Each interaction with the environment is shaped by both objects and human oversight. Interestingly, chroniclers mention that occasional prisoners developed informal techniques to alleviate contact discomfort, such as leaning strategically or distributing weight across surfaces. These adaptations illustrate subtle ingenuity, a quiet negotiation between body and environment. You feel how the integration of mind and body becomes critical for endurance. The combination of stone, iron, and straw produces a layered sensory experience. Touch, temperature, and sound all interact, heightening awareness and shaping every movement, even in stillness. The environment communicates with the body, demanding adaptation, patience, and resilience. Finally, as you rest against cold stone with chains nearby, you notice how these objects define the space without active interference. Their presence shapes perception, posture, and psychological state, turning mere confinement into a persistent, immersive lesson in endurance. You sense how every element, both passive and interactive, contributes to the unique, challenging experience of dungeon life. Sounds in the dungeon were rarely neutral, shaping experience in subtle and persistent ways. Documentation from the period shows that dripping water, the occasional scrape of a rat, and the faint clank of metal filled every moment. You notice how these noises interact with the architecture, echoing unpredictably along stone corridors and narrow passageways. Every footstep, whisper, and shuffle becomes amplified, making songs a rarity and vigilance almost unavoidable. Curiously, some chroniclers report that prisoners interpreted these sounds as signs of approaching guards, distant prisoners, or even supernatural presence. You feel how the mind fills in gaps left by uncertainty, constructing narratives from echoes, drafts, and rustling straw. Sensory input blends with imagination, and even the smallest sound can take on disproportionate significance. Evidence from contemporary accounts suggests that these auditory cues sometimes helped prisoners mark time. The irregular rhythm of dripping water could become a distorted clock, a method of measuring hours without sunlight or conventional timekeeping. You notice how heightened attention to such details offered both a mental anchor and a subtle measure of structure within the otherwise unstructured environment. Oddly, some prisoners reportedly used patterns in sounds to develop mental games or distractions. Repeating sequences of drips or shifts in rodent movements allowed a degree of cognitive engagement. These practices suggest that even in extreme confinement, the human mind seeks rhythm and order, finding creativity in repetition and subtle variation. It's recorded that certain dungeon layouts amplified sounds in unexpected ways. Narrow corridors could carry faint whispers across chambers, and uneven surfaces reflected noise unpredictably. You notice how these effects heightened alertness, turning each creak or clatter into a potentially significant signal. Awareness of auditory patterns became a vital survival skill, blending perception and adaptation. Interestingly, some sources note that prisoners would adjust position or posture in response to sound, leaning against walls, shifting along straw bedding, or curling in corners, helped minimize exposure to drafts while remaining attuned to environmental cues. These behaviors demonstrate how intertwined physical and psychological adaptation became within the dungeon. The dungeon's auditory environment also influenced social dynamics. Accounts suggest that prisoners occasionally communicated using subtle signals, such as tapping metal or shifting chains, or pattern scraping. These minor exchanges allowed for cooperation, warning, or even quiet companionship, underscoring the ingenuity humans can display even under constraint. Documentation shows that persistent noise could affect sleep. The combination of dripping water, shifting rats, and occasional echoes made uninterrupted rest difficult. You imagine a prisoner trying to find comfort while the mind interprets every minor sound as a potential disturbance. Fragmented rest became common, and sleep cycles were shaped as much by environmental cues as by exhaustion. Curiously, the rhythmic nature of some sounds had a dual effect, while they often provoked anxiety or tension. Over time, prisoners learned to anticipate patterns and find small reassurance and consistency. You notice how repetition, even in an unpleasant form, can offer cognitive stability, a subtle form of comfort amidst deprivation. Accounts indicate that chronic exposure to such auditory environments could sharpen perception. Prisoners became attuned to minute differences in sound, learning to detect approaching footsteps, subtle drafts, or shifting animals. This heightened awareness became both a survival mechanism and a form of mental engagement, blending adaptation and observation. Oddly, some chroniclers mention that prisoners would hum or whisper to themselves, creating predictable sounds to counterbalance unpredictable ones. These self-generated auditory patterns provided rhythm, a sense of presence, and a mild distraction from pervasive discomfort. You notice how creativity in sound management illustrates the intersection of psychology and environmental adaptation. Experts have expressed differing opinions on the significance of these soundscapes. Some assert that they were primarily a source of stress, amplifying fear and fatigue, while others suggest they offered structure and orientation. Evidence indicates that both effects occurred, often simultaneously, shaping perception and behavior throughout the night. Curiously, minor environmental noises sometimes guided physical behavior. A drip landing near a puddle could indicate wet flooring, prompting careful movement. The sound of a rat might warn of unseen obstacles or food sources. You notice how acute auditory awareness blends with practical decision-making, influencing both safety and comfort. Some accounts describe prisoners marking time or distance using sound. Repetitive drips, rustles, and echoes became metrics for counting, measuring, or creating mental routines. These adaptations provided subtle structure, reinforcing endurance and attentiveness. You sense how even modest strategies significantly affected daily survival and perception. Interestingly, chroniclers note that prisoners often incorporated imagination into auditory experience. Sounds were interpreted creatively, transforming minor echoes into stories, warnings, or reflections. This mental engagement not only helped pass time, but also shaped resilience, allowing prisoners to maintain focus and agency in an environment dominated by uncertainty. You notice that sound interacts with other sensory perception. Drafts, moisture, and temperature shifts can subtly alter echoes or intensify noises. The mind integrates these cues, creating a continuous feedback loop between perception and action. auditory awareness becomes inseparable from environmental adaptation, a quiet skill honed under constraint. Records indicate that some prisoners develop techniques to reduce anxiety from noise, covering ears with clothing, lying still, or seeking corners with minimal echo were common strategies. These minor adjustments reflect a combination of observation, experimentation, and instinctive adaptation. Oddly, some sources report that prisoners became attuned to patterns in rat movement, using scuttling as indicators of environmental changes, food presence, or moisture shifts. This heightened sensitivity demonstrates the subtle ways humans adapt cognitively to persistent sensory stimuli. Finally, as you remain still in the dungeon, you notice how sound shapes perception and awareness. Every drip, scrape, and echo becomes a marker of space, time, and presence. The auditory landscape teaches vigilance, patience, and subtle ingenuity, illustrating how even the smallest environmental cues contribute to survival and resilience. The dungeon's solitude is occasionally interrupted by visitors, often guards or inquisitors, whose presence transforms the space temporarily. Records from the period indicate that these intrusions were brief, but could be highly disruptive, punctuating long stretches of isolation with tension and uncertainty. You notice how footsteps approaching through corridors produce both anticipation and unease, and how the body instinctively reacts, bracing against cold floors or drawing closer to walls. Curiously, some accounts suggest that prisoners learn to anticipate these visits, listening for the distant clatter of keys, the faint creak of hinges, or subtle shifts in air movement allowed them to prepare for arrival. Even minor cues became critical information, guiding movement and posture while conserving energy in preparation for potential confrontation. You feel how acute attention becomes a survival tool, integrating perception with instinct. Evidence from contemporary sources shows that interactions with guards varied widely. Some were perfunctory, delivering food or inspecting cells, while others involved interrogation or enforcement of discipline. You notice how the unpredictability of human behavior added to the mental strain of confinement. Even a brief exchange could dominate awareness for hours, shaping sleep patterns, posture, and attention. Oddly, some chronicles report that prisoners adapted subtle strategies to reduce the impact of these visits, shifting bedding, adjusting clothing, or positioning themselves to appear calmer were common tactics. These minor interventions provided a sense of agency and control, mitigating the psychological weight of intrusion. You notice how creativity and observation merge to influence survival in the presence of authority. Documentation suggests that guards sometimes imposed additional challenges: sudden exposure to colder corridors, delays in food delivery, or unexpected inspections heightened stress and physical discomfort. The uncertainty of such actions contributed to a persistent state of vigilance. You feel how these intermittent intrusions amplify the dungeon's overall environment, intertwining mental and physical endurance. Interestingly, some accounts indicate that prisoners developed anticipatory routines around visitation schedules, mentally rehearsing responses, aligning bedding strategically, or quietly preparing for observation created structure amidst unpredictability. These behaviors reveal how anticipation, rather than reaction alone, shaped coping strategies. The presence of visitors also affected social dynamics. Accounts reveal that brief conversations, gestures, or shared awareness of inspection could foster subtle alliances or mutual understanding between prisoners. Even limited interaction became significant, providing psychological reinforcement or tactical advantage. You notice how human connection, however minimal, influenced perception and resilience. Some sources describe the sensory impact of visitors, or the creak of boots, clink of metal, or smell of torch smoke or oil heightened awareness of the environment. Prisoners could identify individuals or predict actions based on subtle auditory and olfactory cues, demonstrating the integration of multiple senses in survival strategies. You feel how the body and mind coordinate in response to such intermittent stimuli. Accounts indicate that anticipation of visitors influenced sleep cycles. Prisoners often remained partially alert, adjusting position, monitoring doors, and bracing against drafts. This state of semi-vigilance shaped fragmented rest, where physical and psychological endurance merged. You notice how environmental and social factors converge to dictate bodily rhythms. Oddly, some chroniclers note that prisoners used visitor routines to create mental pacing. Predictable intervals between visits became markers of time, helping measure nights or structure daily mental exercises. These small temporal anchors offered psychological continuity amidst disorienting confinement. Researchers have expressed differing views on the impact of intermittent visits. Some argue they primarily heightened stress and disrupted adaptation, while others suggest they provided rare stimulation and brief relief from monotony. The balance of these effects likely varied depending on the individual disposition and the nature of the visit. Curiously, minor interactions could foster subtle ingenuity. Prisoners learned to communicate non-verbally, observe behavior, and manipulate limited cues to negotiate small comforts. Even the briefest contact could become a platform for strategic adaptation and minor influence over circumstances. Documentation shows that sensory awareness sharpened in response to visits. Every sound, movement, and change in light became meaningful, guiding posture, positioning, and readiness. You notice how constant adaptation to intermittent intrusion enhances attentiveness and fortifies mental resilience. Some historical accounts suggest that prisoners mentally rehearsed responses to visitors, preparing for interrogation, instruction, or movement. This anticipatory practice demonstrates how cognition and imagination blend with environmental adaptation, shaping strategies for both physical and psychological survival. Oddly, some prisoners develop subtle cues to signal presence or need without attracting attention. Adjusting straw, moving slightly, or producing faint sounds allowed communication or preparation during brief intervals. These practices illustrate resourcefulness within highly constrained environments. The unpredictability of visitation reinforces the dungeon's dominance over experience. Even brief moments of human presence alter perception, posture, and awareness, underscoring how attention to detail and adaptability are central to enduring confinement. You feel how the body and mind continuously adjust to subtle environmental and social cues. Finally, as you imagine the room returning to silence after a visitor departs, you notice how the contrast between isolation and intrusion sharpens awareness of every other sensory detail. Sound, temperature, and space regain prominence, reinforcing vigilance and endurance. The intermittent presence of others shapes perception, attention, and survival in ways both subtle and profound. The medieval perception of comfort differed greatly from modern expectations. Contemporary accounts reveal that notions of warmth, personal space, and rest were framed by necessity and social hierarchy. You notice how prisoners, accustomed to enduring harsh conditions, often adapted to discomfort in ways that might seem extreme today. What we consider basic comfort was often seen as a luxury, and the absence of it shaped both daily life and long-term survival strategies. Interestingly, some records suggest that prisoners would find small ways to assert dignity despite the harsh environment, adjusting clothing, carefully arranging straw bedding, or performing minor grooming tasks provided a sense of control. These acts were subtle but psychologically significant, offering moments of agency in a space designed to limit autonomy. You feel how even minor personal rituals could sustain morale over long periods. Accounts from the era indicate that tolerance for cold, damp, and darkness was shaped by prior experience and social conditioning. Individuals accustomed to harsh outdoor labor or austere living may have been more resilient, whereas others struggled with sensory deprivation. This variability illustrates how human perception and endurance are closely tied to context, expectation, and habit. Oddly, some chronicles describe prisoners developing what might be called personal comfort routines, layering rags or straw, curling strategically, or pressing hands against warmer stones became habitual behaviors, almost ritualistic in nature. These strategies highlight the subtle ways humans negotiate environmental constraints, turning necessity into routine. Documentation shows that social hierarchy influenced who had access to slight comforts. Prisoners of higher status might receive marginally thicker bedding, a small mat, or permission to keep personal items. Lower status individuals often had to adapt without any of these allowances, intensifying both physical and psychological hardship. You notice how social structures intersect with environmental challenges, shaping daily experience and survival strategies. Curiously, contemporary observers noted that prisoners sometimes preferred specific sleeping positions, balancing warmth to draft avoidance and the potential for minor surveillance. Even subtle positioning became a negotiation between physical comfort and environmental awareness. You feel how the body instinctively searches for equilibrium in spaces that provide minimal relief. The concept of personal space also differed. Accounts indicate that proximity to walls, corners, or other prisoners could offer warmth or security, yet could also increase tension or risk of disease. Decisions regarding where to lie were informed by observation, experience, and the subtle dynamics of shared space. You notice how strategic awareness extends beyond individual comfort to interactions with others and the environment itself. Interestingly, some prisoners reportedly created minor spatial markers, such as arranging straw or positioning personal items, to claim a sense of ownership within the cell. These small acts reinforced identity and provided psychological stability, illustrating how even austere environments can be shaped by human agency. Records suggest that sensory engagement influenced perception of comfort. Touching walls, adjusting clothing, or sensing subtle drafts allowed prisoners to anticipate environmental changes. Acute awareness of temperature and material properties became a survival tool, guiding both posture and mental state. You notice how perception and physical adaptation are intertwined. Oddly, some sources mention that prisoners would occasionally shift position preemptively, anticipating a draft or the cooling of stone surfaces. These micro-adjustments reflect learned experience, fine-tuned sensitivity, and an ongoing dialogue between the body and its environment. Survival required not only endurance but careful observation and adjustment. Accounts from contemporary observers note that the combination of environmental stressors, cold, damp, poor bedding, and isolation heightened mental acuity in some ways, forcing prisoners to remain alert to minor cues. Oddly, this heightened awareness could be both beneficial and exhausting, requiring careful mental management to maintain equilibrium. Curiously, some prisoners developed mental frameworks for comfort, such as imagining warmth or recalling pleasant experiences to counteract physical deprivation. These cognitive strategies illustrate the interplay between body, mind, and environment, where endurance depends on both physical adaptation and imaginative resilience. Documentation shows that even the perception of warmth or control could be shaped by minor sensory cues. A faint beam of light, the smell of straw, or the distant echo of a door closing might provide reassurance or structure. You notice how attention to such details becomes essential for psychological stability. Oddly, some chronicles describe prisoners creating informal hierarchies or routines around access to slightly warmer or drier spots. Negotiation and observation became as critical as physical endurance, blending social and environmental adaptation. You feel how survival required continuous awareness of both space and others, Evidence indicates that prisoners sometimes modified positions throughout the night to maintain minimal comfort. Stretching, curling, or pressing against warmer surfaces became habitual, almost unconscious strategies. These behaviors illustrate the fine balance between body, environment, and endurance. Interestingly, chroniclers note that prisoners frequently adjusted clothing or bedding in response to subtle environmental shifts. Even minimal intervention could make a significant difference in perceived warmth or dryness, highlighting the importance of attention and subtle action. Researchers have differing interpretations of how prisoners defined comfort. Some suggest it was primarily about physical relief, while others argue that psychological and social factors played equal roles. Evidence points to a combination of influences, where endurance required both mental strategies and physical adaptation. Curiously, some prisoners reportedly developed minor self-soothing techniques, such as humming quietly or engaging in mental recitation, to cope with cold and isolation. These practices illustrate the integration of cognitive and sensory strategies, blending attention, rhythm, and imagination. Finally, as you sit quietly in the dungeon, you sense how medieval concepts of comfort were shaped by necessity, environment, and social context. Every small adjustment, every tactile interaction, and every mental strategy contributes to survival. The interplay of body, mind, and space teaches endurance, subtle ingenuity, and the quiet management of both physical and psychological experience. Prisoners' stories reveal remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and sometimes surprising humor. Accounts from contemporary observers describe individuals finding inventive ways to pass time, distract themselves from cold, or subtly manipulate their environment. You notice how even in the harshest conditions, human creativity persists, offering both practical solutions and psychological relief. Small gestures arranging straw, tracing shapes in stone, or improvising minor routines serve as quiet victories against relentless discomfort. Interestingly, some chronicles recount unusual sleep rituals. A prisoner might balance themselves carefully on uneven straw, rock, or fragments of cloth, creating a temporary system for warmth or support. Evidence from the era suggests that these practices were often shared informally, passed along through observation, creating a subtle culture of adaptation within cells. You feel how these practices demonstrate the intricate relationship between body, environment, and habit. Documentation shows that storytelling was also a vital tool. Prisoners would recount events, myths, or personal experiences, engaging imagination to mitigate the psychological weight of isolation and monotony. Oddly, even brief recitations could shift perception of time, making long hours feel shorter and providing mental comfort in a space dominated by deprivation. Some records indicate that prisoners developed small games or counting exercises to measure days or mark sequences of events. Curiously, these activities offered both cognitive engagement and distraction from discomfort. You notice how the mind seeks patterns, structure, and challenge even when external stimuli are scarce, turning deprivation into a catalyst for creative adaptation. Accounts from the period also describe subtle acts of resourcefulness with limited materials. A shard of wood or a fragment of cloth could be repositioned to provide support or warmth. Evidence suggests that these small improvisations often made the difference between enduring a night and suffering greater discomfort. You feel how acute observation and careful planning become essential survival skills. Oddly, some prisoners are said to have created symbolic markers in their cells, scratches or marks in stone or metal that recorded events or time passed. These gestures, though minor, provided a sense of continuity, memory, and personal agency. You notice how even in a harsh, controlled environment, the need to assert identity and leave traces endures. Contemporary sources note that humour occasionally surfaced as a coping mechanism. Prisoners sometimes created playful mental exercises or told jokes quietly to themselves or companions. These acts may seem trivial, yet they reflect a sophisticated awareness of psychological needs, revealing how resilience includes not only physical endurance but emotional management. Evidence suggests that prisoners often developed intricate strategies to conserve energy. Movement was minimized unless necessary, and subtle adjustments to posture, bedding, or clothing were optimized to maintain warmth. Accounts describe the careful choreography of bodily positioning, a practice requiring both attention and adaptation. You notice how survival emerges from continuous, conscious engagement with the environment. Interestingly, some chronicles describe prisoners using sound and rhythm creatively. The tapping of fingers on stone, the arrangement of small objects, or the timing of movements could form patterns that structured attention and mental focus. You feel how integrating sensory cues into personal rituals provides both diversion and subtle reinforcement of control. Accounts from the era show that shared observation of minor environmental cues fostered informal collaboration. Prisoners might signal each other about approaching draft, potential hazards, or advantageous positions for warmth. These interactions, though constrained, reveal a quiet social ingenuity, demonstrating that survival often depends on both observation and cooperation. Curiously, some prisoners maintained mental records of temperature shifts, drafts, and moisture accumulation. Using memory as a tool, they anticipated environmental changes and adapted accordingly. This practice illustrates a combination of cognitive engagement and practical necessity, turning observation into a survival skill. Evidence from contemporary chronicles notes that prisoners sometimes practice micro-adjustments during sleep. Stretching limbs, curling to conserve heat, or repositioning bedding became habitual behaviors to mitigate discomfort. You notice how these small routines provide subtle structure, reducing unpredictability and promoting endurance. Oddly, some sources suggest that certain prisoners used imagination to create a sense of space or escape, mentally reconstructing familiar landscapes or imagining warmth and sunlight provided temporary relief from sensory deprivation. These exercises highlight the interplay between cognitive resilience and environmental challenge. Accounts indicate that enduring prolonged confinement often required balance between vigilance and rest. Observing auditory, tactile, and olfactory cues remained essential while simultaneously seeking fragmented sleep. You notice how prisoners learn to navigate the tension between alertness and recovery, blending cognition and bodily needs. Interestingly, some chroniclers report that prisoners occasionally engaged in minor rituals with repetitive motion or sound to calm nerves. Tapping, tracing, or quietly arranging straw offered both physical engagement and psychological reassurance. You feel how these repetitive actions provide structure, continuity, and a subtle sense of control. Documentation shows that prisoners sometimes leveraged environmental features to improve comfort, pressing against slightly warmer walls, selecting positions with reduced drafts, or layering straw strategically illustrates adaptation to subtle microclimates. You notice how this intimate knowledge of the cell contributes to both physical relief and mental stability. Curiously, stories emphasize endurance through observation. Prisoners learn to read subtle environmental cues, anticipating discomfort and mitigating challenges through small, repeated actions. These strategies reflect both ingenuity and resilience, highlighting the human capacity to adapt under extreme constraints. Accounts reveal that minor innovations, like adjusting bedding or using small objects to stabilize posture, were sometimes observed and adopted by others. The informal transmission of survival techniques demonstrates communal intelligence and the role of shared experience even in confined, isolating spaces. Finally, as you consider these stories, you realize that the combination of observation and mental engagement and small improvisations illustrates the richness of prisoner ingenuity. Endurance emerges not only from physical strength but from sustained awareness, creativity, and subtle adaptation to environment and circumstance. The dungeon becomes both challenge and classroom, teaching lessons in survival, resourcefulness, and human resilience. Interpretations differ regarding which dungeon conditions were the harshest, and accounts from the period offer contrasting perspectives. Some describe the coldest chambers as low-lying stone rooms with persistent moisture, while others emphasize narrow, dark cells with minimal ventilation. You notice how variation in architecture, geography, and maintenance produced a spectrum of experiences, forcing prisoners to adapt to conditions that could shift daily or even hourly. The uncertainty underscores the challenge of reconstructing life in these environments. Curiously, some chronicles note that prisoners developed mental hierarchies of suffering. Those in slightly drier or better ventilated cells might claim superiority and comfort, while others in the dampest corners learned to endure through observation and ingenuity. Even marginal differences influence perception, social dynamics, and survival strategies. You feel how the environment subtly shaped both psychological and physical resilience. Evidence from contemporary accounts indicates that cold, damp, and darkness interacted with human physiology in complex ways. Weakness from insufficient nutrition amplified sensitivity to chill, while prolonged exposure to moisture increased the likelihood of illness. You notice how these conditions created compounded challenges, each element intensifying the impact of the others. Endurance required attention to multiple factors simultaneously. Interestingly, some sources describe prisoners using small routines to mitigate environmental extremities, adjusting clothing layers, rotating straw bedding, or repositioning against walls provided modest relief. These repeated actions, while minimal, became essential strategies for managing discomfort, illustrating how incremental adaptations could produce meaningful effects over long periods. The precise nature of the worst conditions remains unclear, as surviving documentation is limited and often anecdotal. Accounts vary widely, with some emphasizing cold as the primary threat, others focusing on humidity, darkness, or psychological strain. You notice how ambiguity itself contributes to the challenge of understanding historical experience, reinforcing that human endurance is shaped by interaction with multiple environmental and social variables. Curiously, some prisoners reported peculiar observations: a faint draft, the echo of dripping water, or subtle shifts in temperature could indicate changes in adjacent chambers, signaling relative safety or risk. These small cues became critical tools for survival, blending sensory acuity with intuition. You feel how acute perception becomes a constant necessity in an environment that offers little respite. Accounts from the period reveal that prisoners sometimes created personal measures of hardship. Mental records of temperature, sound, or moisture allowed them to anticipate discomfort and adjust strategies accordingly. These practices illustrate how observation, memory, and foresight integrated into daily life, enabling endurance beyond mere physical strength. Oddly, some sources report that prisoners assigned subjective rankings to different environmental features. A slightly higher ceiling, a marginally drier floor, or a small patch of straw could be valued disproportionately, shaping behavior, morale, and interactions with others. You notice how perception, rather than absolute cognition, dictated experience in nuanced ways. Documentation indicates that environmental extremities also influence social behavior. Cooperation could emerge around shared knowledge of warmth, dryness, or favorable positions, while conflict arose over scarce resources or perceived advantage. You feel how human interaction becomes intertwined with environmental adaptation, blending survival, strategy, and subtle negotiation. Interestingly, chroniclers sometimes describe prisoners engaging in ritualized observation, tracking dripping water, listening for subtle echoes, or monitoring slight shifts in airflow, created structured attention that mitigated psychological strain. You notice how these routines provided both awareness and mental occupation, transforming monotony into deliberate practice. Evidence suggests that sensory sensitivity sharpened over time. Prisoners became acutely attuned to minor variations in sound, temperature, and touch, interpreting environmental cues with remarkable precision. This heightened awareness became both a survival tool and a source of psychological resilience, linking perception to practical action. Curiously, some accounts mention that prisoners used imagination to anticipate environmental challenges, visualizing warmth, planning bedding adjustments, or mentally rehearsing responses to drafts helped maintain composure. You notice how cognitive engagement blends with physical adaptation, creating a dynamic interaction with the dungeon environment. Accounts indicate that prisoners often combined multiple strategies simultaneously, adjusting position, monitoring sensory cues, and applying mental focus allowed them to cope with cold, moisture, darkness, and social uncertainty. You feel how endurance is rarely singular. It relies on integrating observation, cognition, and physical awareness. Oddly, some prisoners reportedly established internal routines to partition time, counting drips, pacing attention across sensory stimuli, and using environmental markers to gauge hours created psychological structure. These measures reinforced resilience and offered subtle control over otherwise uncontrollable circumstances. Evidence from the era shows that survival often depended on proactive adaptation rather than passive endurance. Identifying warmer areas, optimizing clothing layers, and coordinating with cellmates when possible allowed prisoners to maximize comfort within extreme limits. You notice how ingenuity and attentiveness are central to navigating hardship. Some sources suggest that enduring extreme conditions fostered both mental and physical fortitude. The capacity to observe, adapt, and manage multiple stressors simultaneously enabled long-term survival. You feel how challenges imposed by environment shape human resilience in ways that extend beyond immediate suffering. Researchers have expressed contrasting opinions on the role of environmental variation in prisoner experience. Some argue that architecture dictated primary discomfort, while others emphasize social and cognitive strategies. Evidence indicates that both dimensions were critical, with survival shaped by the interaction of body and mind and space. Curiously, accounts mention that prisoners sometimes engaged in subtle competitions or comparisons of endurance. Assessing who could tolerate the cold, damp, or darkness longest became a way to pass time and assert psychological strength. You notice how social cognition intertwined with environmental adaptation, reinforcing resilience through observation and interaction. Finally, as you reflect on the varied conditions across dungeons, you realize that extreme environments demanded integrated strategies. Physical adaptation, cognitive awareness, and social navigation converged to shape experience. Survival was less about any single factor and more about continuous engagement with the environment, turning hardship into subtle, complex lessons in resilience and ingenuity. The lingering effects of dungeon confinement extended long after release. Contemporary accounts describe former prisoners carrying sensations of cold, stiffness, and fatigue for days, sometimes weeks, as their bodies slowly readjusted to open air and warmth. You notice how these after effects could be both physical and psychological, with memories of stone floors, damp walls, and persistent drafts continuing to influence posture, perception, and sleep even outside the cell. Interestingly, some chronicles suggest that former prisoners retained heightened sensitivity to temperature. A sudden draft or the touch of cold stone could trigger vivid recollections of the dungeon. You feel how the body and mind encode extreme experience, creating long-lasting awareness of environmental conditions that were once unavoidable. Evidence from the period indicates that psychological traces were equally enduring. Former inmates reported anxiety in enclosed spaces, heightened alertness to minor sounds, and disrupted sleep patterns. Oddly, These experiences often persisted even in otherwise comfortable or familiar settings, illustrating how acute sensory exposure leaves lasting impressions on perception and cognition. Accounts show that individuals sometimes carried physical reminders of confinement. Joint aches, muscle stiffness, and chronic chills were common, particularly after prolonged periods in damp or cold chambers. You notice how these bodily memories reinforce the psychological impact, creating an enduring connection between environment and somatic experience. Curiously, some sources report that former prisoners maintained behavioral adaptations learned in captivity, adjusting posture to retain warmth, layering clothing, or monitoring airflow became instinctive, even when no longer strictly necessary. These habits highlight the subtle integration of experience into daily life and the persistence of learned strategies for comfort. Documentation reveals that some individuals relied on memory of the dungeon to anticipate environmental stresses in new settings. Awareness of temperature, moisture, and spatial arrangement informed decision-making about sleeping positions, bedding, and shelter. You notice how prior hardship shapes both perceptual acuity and practical behavior, extending lessons from confinement into broader contexts. Interestingly, chroniclers describe the mental strategies employed after release, imagining warmth or sunlight, mentally revisiting familiar outdoor environments, and recreating sensory patterns helped former prisoners recalibrate perception and restore equilibrium. These cognitive exercises illustrate how imagination can complement physical adaptation in recovery from environmental extremes. Evidence from contemporary records indicates that social support played a significant role in mitigating long-term effects. Families, companions, or fellow survivors provided reassurance, physical warmth, and practical guidance, aiding both mental and physical readjustment. You feel how human connection continues to influence resilience long after immediate survival. Oddly, some former prisoners reported heightened vigilance in daily life, remaining alert to potential cold, moisture, or confined conditions. This hyper-awareness, though adaptive in captivity, could be tiring and persistent, highlighting the complex interplay between environmental memory and present experience. Some sources suggest that brief exposure to warmth and comfort could trigger intense emotional responses. Former prisoners often describe moments of relief, warmth, or softness as extraordinarily pleasurable, contrasting sharply with prior deprivation. You notice how extreme hardship recalibrates perception of comfort, making minor environmental differences feel profound. Accounts indicate that physiological recovery often involved gradual restoration of circulation, flexibility, and muscular comfort. Simple movements, stretching, and exposure to dry warmth helped reverse stiffness and numbness accumulated during confinement. Chroniclers emphasize the slow, measured nature of this process, highlighting the enduring influence of prolonged exposure to cold and damp. Curiously, some reports mention that former prisoners developed new rituals around rest and warmth, layering blankets carefully, monitoring airflow, or maintaining small routines around comfort became ingrained habits, extending strategies learned under duress into everyday life. You notice how human behavior adapts to optimize well-being based on prior experience. Evidence from the era suggests that chronic effects could include sensitivity to sensory detail. Former prisoners remained attuned to subtle shifts in temperature, texture, and sound, skills that were advantageous in daily life but could also perpetuate discomfort or alertness. You feel how enduring adaptation shapes perception beyond immediate survival needs. Interestingly, social reintegration could be influenced by these residual experiences. Former prisoners often sought companionship or guidance to navigate environments, relying on collective knowledge to mitigate lingering challenges. You notice how survival strategies learned under duress extend into communal and relational contexts. Oddly, some sources report that memory of dungeon discomfort reinforced emotional resilience. Surviving exposure to extreme cold, dampness, and isolation fostered patience, attentiveness, and the capacity to endure minor discomforts without panic. You feel how past adversity informs present endurance, a subtle psychological benefit emerging from hardship. Documentation indicates that former prisoners sometimes shared experiences with others, transmitting survival knowledge through storytelling. These narratives preserved practical strategies, cognitive techniques, and emotional coping mechanisms for future generations. You notice how lived experience becomes both guidance and cultural memory, extending lessons beyond the individual. Some accounts suggest that lingering cold and dampness influenced occupational choices after release. Individuals with heightened sensitivity often selected environments that minimized exposure, demonstrating how past conditions shape decision-making in subtle yet meaningful ways. You feel how enduring environmental memory guides behavior long after immediate danger has passed. Researchers have expressed differing interpretations of the long-term impact of dungeon exposure. Some argue that physical effects were temporary and psychological effects minor, while others emphasize the persistent influence on perception, behavior, and resilience. Evidence suggests a combination, highlighting the complex interplay between body, mind, and environment in shaping post-confinement life. Finally, as you reflect on these enduring consequences, you realize that the dungeon's influence extended far beyond immediate survival. Physical sensations, mental strategies, and behavioral adaptations all persisted, demonstrating how extreme environments leave lasting imprints on human experience. Endurance, observation, and subtle ingenuity continued to shape perception and behavior, illustrating the profound legacy of confinement. Records from the time show that lighting in dungeons was minimal and unreliable. Torches and small candles offered only fleeting illumination, casting flickering shadows that exaggerated the shapes of walls, chains, and rough stone surfaces. You notice how these low-light conditions force the eyes to adjust constantly, heightening sensitivity to movement and detail while making navigation both physically and mentally demanding. Even minor changes in brightness could trigger awareness of drafts, uneven floors, or obstacles, influencing every motion within the cell. Curiously, some accounts note that prisoners sometimes relied on residual daylight through narrow slits to gauge the passage of time. Observing subtle shifts in sunlight allowed them to mark hours and plan limited activities. This adaptation highlights the interplay between environmental constraints and human ingenuity, showing how even faint traces of light became vital for orientation and mental stability. Evidence suggests that flickering torchlight had a dual effect. While it provided a small sense of safety and visibility, it also cast exaggerated shadows that could distort perception. Oddly, some prisoners interpreted these shadows as figures or movement, intensifying anxiety or creating mental games to distract from fear. You feel how the mind blends sensory input with imagination in low-light conditions, producing both alertness and coping mechanisms. Accounts preserved in chronicles describe techniques used to maximize available light, positioning torches in corners, using reflective metal or glass fragments, or arranging bedding to catch stray illumination were common strategies. You notice how attention to minor details could improve both physical comfort and mental assurance, emphasizing the subtle interaction between environment and adaptation. Interestingly, some sources report that prisoners became highly attuned to the nuances of candlelight. Differences in flicker, smoke, or warmth could indicate a draft, proximity of a guard, or deterioration of fuel. Such awareness demonstrates the integration of sensory perception and survival skills, showing how acute attention to light influenced both safety and comfort. Documentation shows that darkness combined with other sensory deprivation heightened sensitivities to sound and touch, from dripping water, rustling straw, and cold stone became more pronounced in the absence of steady light. You notice how perception becomes layered, with each sensory channel feeding into vigilance, adaptation, and the subtle management of discomfort. Oddly, some chronicles describe prisoners using light creatively for communication. Flickering a torch in patterned sequences could signal presence or alert nearby inmates. Even minor innovation transformed a scarce resource into a tool for survival and subtle social interaction. You feel how ingenuity arises naturally in constrained environments. Contemporary documents indicate that the quality of light affected sleep. Flickering illumination could interfere with rest, while complete darkness encouraged fragmented yet necessary periods of unconsciousness. You notice how environmental conditions directly shape circadian rhythms, blending physiology with perception in a continuous negotiation with space. Some sources unexpectedly report that prisoners develop mental exercises to compensate for dim light, imagining the layout of cells, tracing walls with fingertips, or recalling visual details helped maintain orientation and reduce disorientation. These cognitive adaptations illustrate how imagination complements physical perception in environments designed to limit both. Evidence suggests that low light also shaped emotional responses. Shadows could provoke fear, while brief illuminations offered reassurance. Observers of the period note that subtle changes in lighting influenced mood, alertness, and the ability to manage discomfort. You notice how perception, emotions, and environmental interaction are deeply intertwined. Accounts show that prisoners learn to exploit even minor variations in lighting, positioning themselves near residual daylight, reflecting torchlight off surfaces, or adjusting bedding to catch illumination improved both physical and psychological comfort. You feel how these small strategies create micro-advantages within an otherwise harsh setting. Curiously, some chronicles describe prisoners using shadows for self-expression. Scratches or patterns traced in walls became visible only in flickering light, offering moments of the identity assertion or private communication. You notice how even minimal light enables subtle forms of agency and adaptation. Documentation reveals that the timing and duration of light exposure influenced social dynamics. Prisoners who understood the patterns of torch or candle use could coordinate movement, conversation, or small tasks with greater efficiency. You feel how observation of environmental patterns fosters both survival and cooperation. Interestingly, some sources suggest that light variations created mental rhythms. The interplay of flicker and shadow could regulate attention, provide cues for action, or serve as a subtle measure of time. You notice how prisoners harnessed these rhythms to structure otherwise unstructured days. Evidence indicates that the scarcity of reliable light intensified reliance on other senses. Touch, hearing, and smell became primary tools for navigating the dungeon and managing discomfort. You notice how sensory integration becomes vital for endurance, as perception and adaptation intersect continuously. Oddly, some chronicles describe prisoners using reflections creatively. Polished metal fragments, small glass, or wet surfaces could amplify faint light, creating pockets of visibility. These improvisations demonstrate resourcefulness and attention to detail, allowing control over a seemingly uncontrollable environment. Accounts from the period suggest that prisoners who adapted successfully to low-light conditions often displayed enhanced spatial awareness and memory of layouts. Navigating unfamiliar corridors or avoiding obstacles became second nature, reflecting the development of environmental literacy born of necessity. You notice how survival depends on the integration of perception, cognition, and subtle environmental cues. Curiously, some prisoners maintained mental narratives tied to light and shadow, imagining pathways, recounting visual details, or visualizing objects in memory helped reduce disorientation and anxiety. These cognitive strategies illustrate how imagination and observation complement one another under extreme constraints. Finally, as you sit quietly in the flickering half-light of the dungeon, you notice how perception of space, movement, and safety is shaped by minimal illumination. Each shadow, glimmer, and reflection becomes meaningful, guiding attention, posture, and adaptation. The environment teaches vigilance, ingenuity, and the delicate balance of body and mind in response to scarce and variable light. The final night in a dungeon reveals layers of experience that are difficult to describe fully. Accounts from contemporary observers indicate that prisoners often became intimately familiar with the subtle rhythms of their environment. You notice how every drip of water, distant echo, and draft shapes attention, forcing the mind to remain alert even when the body longs for rest. Endurance is measured not only by physical survival, but by the capacity to adapt continually to shifting sensory input. Interestingly, some chronicles suggest that prisoners developed complex routines that integrated observation, movement, and imagination, adjusting bedding, layering clothing, and mentally rehearsing responses to drafts or sudden noise became second nature. These repeated actions provided structure, comfort, and a sense of control within a space that offered little. You feel how habit transforms necessity into skill, and awareness into quiet mastery. Evidence indicates that psychological strategies were as critical as physical ones. Engaging the mind through counting, reciting prayers, or imagining warmth helped prisoners manage discomfort, fear, and isolation. Oddly, these mental exercises could provide relief comparable to modest physical adjustments. You notice how endurance relies on both cognition and body working together, each reinforcing the other in subtle ways. The environment itself seems alive. Stone floors retain chill, walls exhale moisture, and air currents shift unpredictably. Contemporary records describe prisoners learning to anticipate these movements, creating adaptive behaviors that blend instinct, observation, and past experience. You notice how a small adjustment curling slightly, pressing against a warmer wall, or shifting bedding can produce tangible improvement in comfort. Curiously, the interplay of sensory cues is constant. Drips mark time, rustling straw signals movement, and faint odours indicate moisture or the presence of others. Prisoners integrated these signals into routines, developing intimate knowledge of their surroundings. This sensory literacy allowed them to respond effectively, preserve energy, and maintain vigilance. You feel how finely tuned perception becomes a survival skill in an environment designed to resist comfort. Accounts suggest that social observation played a role even in isolation. Subtle signs of other prisoners' presence, faint echoes, or shared rhythms influence positioning, strategies for warmth and psychological coping. You notice how awareness of both environment and fellow inmates contributes to a complex network of adaptive behaviors. Oddly, some chronicles describe imaginative engagement as a tool for endurance, visualizing open space, recalling sunlight, or mentally creating warmth helped mitigate the oppressive effects of darkness, damp, and cold. These exercises demonstrate the human capacity to convert mental focus into a form of relief, bridging sensory deprivation with psychological resilience. Evidence from the period shows that minor improvisations often made measurable differences. Adjusting straw, moving a fragment of wood, or strategically layering rags could alter comfort for hours. Prisoners learned to experiment, observe effects, and refine actions, creating small, cumulative improvements that enhanced survival. You notice how attention to detail, combined with creativity, transforms deprivation into opportunity. Interestingly, chroniclers report that enduring repeated nights of discomfort instilled both patience and adaptability. Prisoners learned to anticipate challenges, optimize minor advantages, and manage limited resources with precision. The repeated practice of adjustment and observation became a form of mastery over circumstance, a quiet education in resilience. Accounts indicate that the final moments of night were often the most difficult. Fatigue, cold, hunger, and anticipation combined to heighten perception of every detail. You feel how the body, mind, and environment interact dynamically, each influencing the other in a continuous cycle of awareness and adaptation. Curiously, some prisoners described fleeting moments of comfort when small environmental factors aligned. A trace of warmth from stone, a slight decrease in draft, or a minimal improvement in bedding could produce relief that felt disproportionately significant. You notice how even modest advantages become psychologically and physically meaningful in extreme conditions. Researchers offer contrasting views on the lasting impact of such experiences. Some emphasize the development of resilience, acute observation, and adaptive skill, while others highlight the long-term psychological and physiological strain. Evidence suggests both outcomes occurred, reflecting the profound complexity of life under confinement. Oddly, some accounts suggest that prisoners created personal rituals around these moments of relief, positioning themselves precisely, arranging bedding strategically, or repeating mental exercises transformed small advantages into structured comfort. You notice how subtle repetition fosters both mastery and emotional stability. Documentation shows that the integration of body and mind and environment defines survival. Awareness of temperature, moisture, light, sound, and spatial constraints informs every adjustment, every posture, and every thought. Endurance is continuous, adaptive, and deeply intertwined with environmental perception. Interestingly, the persistence of sensory memory extends beyond confinement. Former prisoners often retain a heightened sensitivity to temperature, draft, and environmental cues, demonstrating how extreme experience leaves enduring impressions. You notice how memory and habit and awareness continue to influence behavior long after physical exposure ends. Evidence suggests that reflection on the dungeon experience became part of psychological resilience. Remembering successful adaptations, small victories, and survival strategies reinforced confidence, patience, and ingenuity. You feel how integration of past learning enhances present endurance and future preparedness. Oddly, some prisoners reported a paradoxical sense of calm amidst the harshest conditions. Engagement with environment, structured routines, and minor rituals created a sense of agency that mitigated despair. You notice how deliberate action, even under extreme constraint, can cultivate mental equilibrium. Curiously, the final hours often involved a blend of physical preparation and mental focus, adjusting straw, arranging clothing, and observing environmental cues created conditions for the briefest comfort. Simultaneously, imagination and attention provided psychological scaffolding, sustaining endurance. You notice how survival merges action, awareness, and cognitive engagement seamlessly. Accounts indicate that sensory integration becomes nearly automatic. Awareness of light, temperature, sound, and touch guides posture, decision-making, and micro-adjustments. The mind and body operate in tandem, continuously negotiating with the environment. You feel how practice, combined repetition, and adaptation produce subtle mastery over discomfort. Finally, as you reflect on the dungeon's persistent lessons, you recognize that survival depends on continuous observation, careful adjustment, and imaginative engagement. Endurance emerges from an intricate balance of sensory awareness, mental focus, and physical adaptation. The dungeon teaches patience, resilience, and subtle ingenuity, leaving lasting impressions that extend far beyond the cold, damp stone. In the quiet after months of hardship, you notice the rhythm of your own breathing, the small movements of your body, and the faint echoes around you. Every sense remains active, attuned to comfort, warmth, and survival. Yet there is a growing calm. Reflection and awareness converge, teaching endurance not only of the body but of mind and spirit. The night winds down slowly, and you imagine the gradual easing of tension, the soft settling of muscles, and the gentle fading of vigilance. Each breath becomes a meditation, each sensation a lesson in adaptation. Even in the absence of modern comfort, you sense how human resilience, observation, and creativity persist. The dungeon is harsh, unyielding, and demanding, yet it shapes endurance, attention, and quiet mastery in ways both subtle and profound. Sleep well,